In the dust of vanished ziggurats and beneath layers of sun-baked clay lie 53 ancient questions no god ever bothered to answer. They built cities before history, mapped stars before reason, and then left behind riddles carved in stone. This isn't a timeline, it's a graveyard of logic. From lizard gods to missing cities, forgotten math to divine bureaucracies, Mesopotamia didn't just invent civilization, it made it weird. So, light a lamp, sharpen your skepticism, and welcome to 2 hours of unexplained mysteries about ancient Mesopotamia, where every answer leads deeper into the unknown. Before we dive headfirst into ancient confusion, take a second to subscribe because you clearly enjoy unraveling the things no one else dares to explain. And while you're here, where are you watching from? What time is it for you right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in the blurry hours where history starts to feel personal? Drop it in the comments. I read them like they're cuneiform. Where the Sumerians ultimately came from, their language is an isolate. Somewhere around 4500 BCE, a group of strangers walked into the southern marshes of Mesopotamia and decided to invent civilization from scratch. No one invited them. They didn't speak the language. In fact, they spoke a language that no one else on earth could understand. Not then, not now, not ever. This language is called Sumerian, and it is a linguistic orphan, an isolate, which is academic code for we have no idea who these people were, where they came from, or why they spoke like aliens trying to sound important. To this day, scholars argue whether the Sumerians descended from Iranian highlanders, Eastern Arabian coastal migrants, or just popped out of the swamp like sentient frogs carrying cuneiform tablets. No DNA evidence has tied them conclusively to any modern population. No migration trail exists. No founding myth even tries to explain their arrival. They just are fully formed, bureaucratically obsessed, and already arguing about grain distribution. And then there's their writing. While everyone else in the world was still painting deer on cave walls, the Sumerians were busy drawing wedge-shaped signs into clay tablets, most of which complained about the wrong barley shipment or how many goats were owed in taxes. Their pictographs evolved into abstract symbols before phonetics even entered the scene, which is like building a calculator before discovering numbers. But the linguistic weirdness doesn't stop at structure. Sumerian had no known relatives, and its grammar is creatively cursed. Agglutinative, naturally, with ergative absolutive alignment, don't ask, and a vocabulary full of words for bureaucratic roles and obscure building types. They had 15 words for temple hierarchy, but no clear word for friend. Some theories have tried to tie them to Dravidian roots. Others suggest they came from the east, maybe even from the Zagros Mountains. But all of these are wishful thinking wrapped in academic jargon. If the Sumerians left behind a clue to their homeland, they wrote it in code, buried it under a ziggurat, and then salted the earth. Of course, we could ask the Sumerians themselves if any of them were still around. But unfortunately, they vanished as mysteriously as they appeared, gradually absorbed into later empires until their language was relegated to the dusty role of a priestly secret code. So where did the Sumerians come from? The short answer, nowhere we can prove. The long answer, somewhere that doesn't exist anymore or never did. And just when you think that's the weirdest thing about them, remember, they counted everything in 60-second. Why? Base 60 sexagesimal mathematics was adopted and persisted for millennia. Have you ever asked yourself why clocks have 60 minutes? Or why circles are divided into 360 degrees? Or why Babylonian scribes kept making everyone's lives harder by refusing to use base 10 like normal people? Blame the Sumerians. At some point, these swamp-dwelling proto-bureaucrats looked at a pile of grain and thought, you know what would make this easier? Multiplying everything by 60. Why? No one knows. Some argue it's because 60 is a superior highly composite number, which is the kind of thing only mathematicians and lonely numerologists say when no one's asked them anything. It's true that 60 is divisible by many numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 12. But practicality alone doesn't explain the religious obsession with it. Because this wasn't just math, it was cosmology. The heavens were measured in 360 degrees, time was subdivided into 12 and 60, and priest astronomers would stare at the sky all night to keep track of it. Clearly, this wasn't just accounting. It was metaphysics with a stylus. Even more confusing, this sexagesimal system persisted. The Babylonians inherited it, tweaked it, and used it to track planetary motion and divine omens. And somehow, we still use it today. Every time you glance at a clock or curse the 59 seconds before your microwave dings, you're participating in a Mesopotamian math cult older than the pyramids. But the real kicker? They didn't even have a true zero. Not at first. They left blank spaces, literal blanks. Which is adorable until you try to calculate anything serious and realize your accountant might have just forgotten the placeholder. Was this system designed for humans? Definitely not. It was designed for gods who never needed to file taxes. And yet, it worked. It predicted eclipses. It organized calendars. It helped build ziggurats and schedule ritual goat slaughters. For a system that makes zero intuitive sense, it somehow managed to shape the entire framework of modern science. But why did they invent it? Because 10 fingers wasn't enough? Because base 60 looked cooler chiseled into clay? Or because the Sumerians saw patterns we've long forgotten? In any case, their strange math stuck. Long after the Sumerians faded into the mud, their number system still ticks away inside every digital clock. Which brings us, neatly, to the places where time itself was measured in towers dedicated to the gods. What exactly happened? Atop Ziggurat's astronomy, initiation rites, meeting the gods, or all three? Imagine a massive step pyramid rising out of the desert haze, layer after layer of sun-baked mud brick, topped with a gleaming temple that no one could enter unless they had the right name, lineage, title, sacrifice, password, and probably a decent haircut. That was a ziggurat. Half mountain, half temple, and fully mysterious. Everyone agrees that ziggurats were sacred spaces, but beyond that, it's a free-for-all. Some say they were observatories. Others insist they were stairways for the gods to descend. And some fringe theorists argue they were launch pads for ancient astronauts, which would explain the bad landings in Akkadian mythology. What we do know is that ordinary people didn't go up there. The ziggurat wasn't your neighborhood chapel. It was a vertical stage for something else, something ritual, something elite, something very quiet. The temple at the summit was reserved for priests, high officials, and possibly a god or goddess who may or may not have lived there part-time. Some texts hint that the top of the ziggurat housed a bed, a literal bed, for the god, or the high priestess. Or maybe for both, depending on whether the rite involved metaphorical union or something more participatory. Welcome to the sacred marriage ceremony, where cosmic balance was restored through suggestive symbolism or awkward performances in full view of the divine. But it wasn't all celestial romance. There's evidence that these towering platforms served as astronomical stations from which Mesopotamian stargazers tracked planetary movements with obsessive precision. The ziggurat was where science met spirituality, where the heavens were charted, the calendar fixed, and the future foretold through the flickering positions of stars that nobody dared misinterpret. And if that wasn't enough mystery, consider this: no one knows what they looked like at their peak. Most ziggurats are ruins, baked mud cores stripped of their outer tiles, their colors faded, their stairways broken. The famed Etemenanki of Babylon, possibly the prototype for the Tower of Babel, was so massive that even Alexander the Great tried to restore it and gave up. What happened up there? Divine whispers? Planetary reckoning? Royal performances? All three? None? We only have guesses: clay tablets that hint, walls that crumbled, rituals that were too sacred or embarrassing to write down. But down in the southern delta, in the ruins of even older temples, archaeologists found something even stranger: figurines, small, wide-eyed, and reptilian. The purpose of Ubaid period, lizard figurines cult, ancestor spirits, something else? They're only a few inches tall, fragile, abstract, hand-molded in clay and painted in faded green. And yet, somehow, the Ubaid lizard figurines are among the most unsettling things ever dug out of the Mesopotamian dirt. Discovered in the ruins of temples dating to around 5000 BCE, long before the invention of writing, wheel spinning, or even cuneiform grumbling, these statues are small, smooth, and eerily detailed. They have elongated snouts, slitted eyes, flattened skulls, thin arms clutching their abdomens. Some appear female, with wide hips and suggestive bulges, a few cradle infants. Others wear what looks like ceremonial headgear. All of them stare like they know something. This is not the kind of art you accidentally make. This is intentional weirdness. Scholars have proposed dozens of theories, all of them wildly unsatisfying. Maybe they were fertility idols, or ritual dolls, or early gods. Maybe they were symbolic stand-ins for some hybrid human-animal mythology, like ancient lizard midwives blessing the next generation. Sure, that's one possibility. So is cultic cosplay gone wrong. Some believe the lizard forms represent spirits or deities of water. After all, the Ubaid people lived in marshland, surrounded by canals, snakes, reeds, and amphibians. Maybe the figurines were placed in shrines to summon fertility from the swamp. Or maybe they were modeled on real-world animals that have since disappeared, dragging their cults with them into the prehistoric void. But the timing makes it worse. These statues weren't made during a high civilization with myths and temples and trained priests. No, this was pre-everything. No texts, no writing. Just these strange, stylized figures buried under abandoned shrines, staring silently upward as if waiting for a return. And they're not unique to one city. They appear in Eridu, the oldest known city in southern Mesopotamia, but also in Tel al-Ubaid and other scattered Ubaid sites, which implies some kind of shared cult, or at the very least, a shared discomfort with standard human anatomy. The problem is that these figurines don't match any known mythology. Later Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians had gods, demons, monsters, yes, but not like these. They never mention divine lizard women with ceremonial hats. There's no temple of the reptile mother in the epics. So if the cult survived, it did so quietly. Or it didn't survive at all. Which brings us to the other theory, that these were ancestor figures, that the lizard faces were symbolic, representing the unknowable dead, preserved in sacred form. In that case, the message is clear. Your ancestors were not like you. They were older, stranger, less mammalian. Of course, none of this explains why they look like the villains from a low-budget sci-fi film, or why certain conspiracy theorists have decided these are proof of ancient alien overlords who genetically engineered the human race and left behind ceramic trophies. Because obviously the first thing space reptiles would do is leave behind art. But whatever they were, deities, spirits, effigies, warnings, the figurines weren't random. They meant something, to someone, in a world we no longer recognize. And they left behind just enough unease to keep us wondering, what did they worship? What did they fear? And why did they carve it with such precision? Maybe the answer lies in the next shelf over, in the ancient temples, where a sea of stone eyes once watched from the darkness, the meaning of the Telbrock eye idols and the cult they served. At first glance, the eye idols of Telbrock seem kind of adorable. Small, flat, stylized figurines carved out of alabaster or gypsum, they resemble minimalist cartoon ghosts with two enormous eyes and no mouth. Some have eyebrows, some have eyelashes. Some are stacked like snowmen. Most are armless, legless, and eerily identical. What could possibly be threatening about a room full of tiny ghost babies with giant eyes? Well, context. Always context. Because these little eye effigies weren't scattered across ancient homes like Sumerian Funko Pops. They were buried in huge numbers inside a single temple in the heart of Tel Brak, an early urban site in northern Mesopotamia, long predating written history. We're talking thousands of them, stacked, piled, and arranged in deliberate clusters, as if some mass ritual had taken place and nobody dared clean up afterward. Archaeologists dubbed it the Eye Temple because what else do you name a sanctuary filled wall to wall with staring figurines? But here's the thing. No inscriptions, no context, no labels saying, to Marduk, best wishes. Just these mute, wide-eyed offerings. And what they're doing, what they're for, is an open question that makes modern scholars twitch. Some think the eyes were meant to symbolize eternal vigilance offerings to a deity who sees all. Perhaps the figurines were devotional placeholders. I can't be here watching the altar all day, so here's my surrogate, complete with retina. Others interpret them as votive prayers, icons meant to watch on behalf of the worshippers, sending a constant, unblinking petition to the god or goddess of the temple. But then there's the creepier possibility that the eye idols weren't symbols of prayer, but judgment. Maybe those rows of staring faces weren't meant to protect anyone but to observe, to record, to stare you down as you performed your ritual duties, or your sacred lies, or your half-hearted sacrifices. It's also entirely possible they represented the god themselves, a god with no body, no voice, just sight. And what kind of deity demands thousands of tiny stone eyeballs from its followers? A deity of guilt, perhaps, or paranoia, or justice, in its most faceless form. Of course, some will say we're reading too much into it, that these were just ancient knickknacks, offerings for good luck, leftovers from a potter's overstock bin. But even then, why eyes? Why so many? Why only in one location? Why the eerie uniformity across hundreds of years? And perhaps most importantly, why did the practice stop? The eye temple was eventually abandoned. The idols ceased. Whatever god they were watching for either left, died, or was no longer welcome. Still, the idea persists. Even now, the image of the eye carries sacred weight, protection, surveillance, power. From the evil eye to CCTV, the concept of being watched never quite left us. Just as the Tel Brak idols never blinked, not once. And while those eyes watched from the north, something even larger was stirring in the south, the first great Mesopotamian city, and with it, a mystery not of statues, but of colonists. The true nature of the Uruk expansion planned colonization or organic trade diaspora. Around 3500 BCE, something strange began to happen across the Near East. Tiny settlements, hundreds of miles from Sumer, suddenly began to look like miniature versions of Uruk, the colossal city in southern Mesopotamia. Same style of pottery, same cylinder seals, same building layouts. It was as if the Uruk culture had been copy-pasted across an entire continent. This was no slow, peaceful osmosis. It was abrupt, uniform, and weirdly specific. So, what happened? Some scholars say this was a deliberate campaign of colonization, the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of corporate franchising. Uruk merchants and temple bureaucrats fanned out across the land, setting up trade posts, resource hubs, and administrative centers, like little embassies of order and grain surplus. Others argue for a more organic model, that the fame of Uruk, with its dazzling temples and record-breaking bureaucracy, simply pulled people in. Locals imitated what worked. Cultural diffusion, not conquest. But here's where it gets messy. The evidence doesn't match either model cleanly. These so-called Uruk colonies weren't just superficial knockoffs. They had the real goods, uruk style, beveled rim bowls, tablets, seals, yet they also retained local elements, hybrid architecture, blended styles, as if the visitors came to stay but didn't fully replace the locals. Which raises the question, were they migrants, traders, priests, colonial administrators, refugees, missionaries from the cult of bureaucracy? And why did they go? Uruk was doing just fine, urban, dense, centrally planned. So why send people out to distant valleys, over mountains, across deserts? Some say it was trade. Uruk needed metals, wood, and labor. But trade alone doesn't explain the sudden appearance of large-scale administrative infrastructure in backwater towns. You don't build a temple to balance your copper ledger. You build it because someone important expects results. Then there's the ominous detail. Many of these outposts were short-lived, abandoned, burned, vanished within a few generations. Whatever the Uruk expansion was, it ended badly. One theory suggests that resentment brewed in the periphery, that locals grew tired of these temple accountants from the south showing up with their smug tablets and sacrificial protocols. That the expansion wasn't a cultural wave but a hostile takeover, resisted and eventually overthrown. Others point to climate stress. Maybe the whole system relied on harvests that eventually failed, or on river routes that dried up, or on a political engine that ran out of scribes. But no one really knows, because there are no manifestos, no inscriptions saying, "We, the people of Uruk, hereby colonize your humble hilltop village." Just pottery, seals, bricks, traces of a system no one explained. And once the colonies vanished, Uruk itself kept going unbothered, unrepentant, until one day a royal burial pit opened up in Ur, and someone very important was placed inside it along with a suspicious number of dead attendants. Queen Puabi's exact status and how the royal cemetery of Ur death pit attendants actually died. The British archaeologist Leonard Woolley thought he'd found paradise when he uncovered the royal cemetery of Ur in the 1922nd. What he found instead was a death pit and a mystery that's only gotten worse with time. At the center of it all lies Queen Puabi. Or maybe she was a priestess, or a queen-priestess hybrid. Or maybe she wasn't a queen at all, just rich and unusually good at throwing funerals. We don't actually know. Her tomb, labeled PG 800, was loaded with gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, musical instruments, a chariot, and an elaborate headdress that could make Cleopatra blush. Oh, and the bodies of at least 74 servants, arranged like ritual furniture around her. Other tombs in the cemetery had similar scenes. Dozens of attendants, men and women lying in rows, still wearing ceremonial dress, accompanied by harps, lyres, cups, weapons, peaceful, quiet, as if everyone had calmly decided to die together. Woolley was convinced this was ritual suicide, that when a royal figure died, their household followed, drinking a narcotic, maybe, lying down in a sacred arrangement and heading to the underworld together. It's a lovely theory, poetic, dignified, also probably wrong. Later analyses revealed head trauma, blunt force injuries, signs of deliberate execution, not peaceful passing. In some cases, the ritual deaths look a lot like murders. Not cultic loyalty, but enforced silence. Were these attendants sacrificed? Volunteers? Victims? If Queen Puabi did oversee this event, she certainly didn't leave a note. And what was her status, really? Her cylinder seal reads, Puabi Nin. Nin can mean lady, queen, or priestess, depending on context. No mention of a husband. No male ruler buried beside her. Could she have ruled independently? Could she have been the real power in Ur? It wouldn't be the last time Mesopotamia pulled a fast one with its power dynamics. Still, the pageantry of her tomb is unmistakable. Whoever she was, Puabi was important enough to command spectacle and death on demand. Was it religious? Political? Did her servants believe they were joining her in a better world? Or did they believe nothing at all, just that resistance was futile? To this day, the royal cemetery is equal parts art and horror. Gold lyres beside crushed skulls, beaded veils next to copper axes. It's hard to tell where reverence ends and terror begins. And if you think that's unsettling, wait until you try to pin down the location of a place called Dilmun, which may or may not have existed, depending on which clay tablet you ask. The shifting, precise location and identity of Dilmun across periods. Somewhere out there, possibly in the Persian Gulf, possibly under it, possibly in the minds of exhausted scribes, Dilmun existed. It was described in Sumerian texts as a place of purity and paradise, where the raven did not croak and the lion did not slay. A land untouched by sickness, death, or even snakes. The gods bathed there. Immortals dwelled there. Gilgamesh passed through it on his road to the underworld, and apparently, copper shipments came from it on a fairly regular basis. So, which is it? A mythical Eden? A real-world trading hub? A political vassal? A mythologized customs zone with excellent branding? Well, yes, that's the problem. Dilmun starts out as this glowing, sacred place on the horizon of Mesopotamian, thought mystical, untouchable, a kind of cosmic Switzerland for divine beings. But the more you read into it, the more mundane it becomes. Over time, texts begin referring to Dilmun as a port of trade, somewhere you could send messengers, receive goods, and possibly bribe customs officials. And yet, its exact location shifts constantly, depending on the century, tablet, and political climate. In some texts, it's a land across the sea, suggesting somewhere in modern-day Bahrain or eastern Arabia. In others, it seems to drift farther south, possibly Oman. At one point, it may have been on the eastern shore, and later rebranded itself on the western shore. It's like the Las Vegas of the Bronze Age, always moving, always expanding, always somehow real and unreal at the same time. Scholars have gone on decades-long quests to pin it down. They've dredged Gulf coastlines, matched trade routes, carbon-dated pottery, and compared cuneiform spelling mistakes. Still, no consensus. Even when Dilmun shows up in royal correspondence, the clues are just vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. One moment it's the land of the gods. The next, it's sending invoices for bitumen and dates. This dual identity, the sacred and the administrative, tells you everything about Mesopotamian worldview. Even their paradises needed export permits. What's most baffling is how long Dilmun stayed relevant. It persisted in texts from the early dynastic period to the Neo-Babylonian era. A millennia-spanning mystery, referenced like everyone should know exactly where it is, but no one leaves a map. Even its decline is ambiguous. Did it sink, collapse, get absorbed into another polity? Or did the scribes just get tired of pretending it existed? We'll probably never know. Dilmun is like a mirage in clay, a place half remembered, half invented, and always one step beyond reach. Still, while Dilmun stayed maddeningly vague, its neighbor in mystery Maggan comes across as a little more muscular. Less paradise, more quarry. Where Maggan really was, and how its polity functioned. Maggan, the land of copper, the land of ships. The land where you could get a proper block of stone, a decent ingot of metal, and maybe, just maybe, your face bashed in by a local warlord if you didn't pay up. If Dilmun was the mythic partner in Mesopotamian trade, Maggan was the rougher cousin who actually delivered the goods. First referenced in Sumerian texts from around 2300 BCE, Maggan is often paired with Meluha and Dilmun in the famous trio of foreign lands. While meluha remains a mystery wrapped in coconut fiber and Dilmun hides behind its spa day branding, Maggan seems a little more grounded, yet still just as elusive. Most scholars loosely connect Maggan with modern-day Oman or southeastern Arabia based on references to copper mining and seafaring, which makes sense. The area has prehistoric copper mines, plenty of boat-building timber, and a handy coastline that faces Mesopotamia with the smirk of an experienced exporter. But Maggan wasn't just a mine and a dock. Texts mention its rulers sometimes as allies, sometimes as adversaries. In some Akkadian inscriptions, Maggan kings are said to have sent tribute. In others, they're crushed beneath Sargon's sandals, which probably tells you more about Mesopotamian propaganda than it does about actual Magganite diplomacy. Still, it's clear that Maggan had a political identity, not just a geological one. It was a polity, not just a pin on a merchant's map. It had leaders, armies, ports, and possibly heresy of heresies its own way of doing math. How did it function? We don't know. We have no records from Maggan itself. It's like learning about Canada entirely through angry tweets from New York. All we see are the edges, tribute lists, trade manifests, and the occasional note about a foreign boat arriving from the land of Maggan. Yet despite this absence of internal documentation, Maggan keeps turning up in Mesopotamian records. Someone, somewhere, was sailing those ships. Someone was managing the mining. Someone was giving orders. Whether it was a king, a chief, a council, or a glorified copper cartel, the engine ran long enough to become legendary. Eventually, Maggan faded from records, replaced by other lands, other trade routes, other mysteries. But not before leaving behind a ghostly imprint, the name of a place that always had copper, always had boats, and never quite let you know who was steering the wheel. Which brings us to the final member of the foreign trade trifecta, the most stubbornly elusive of them all. A place called Meluha, whose mystery isn't just about where it was, but what language its people spoke. What? Where Meluha was, and which language its merchants spoke. Ah, Meluha, the ancient equivalent of the rich neighbor everyone talked about, but never quite invited to dinner. References to Meluha are scattered across Mesopotamian texts, like vague memories of a summer fling, enticing, confusing, and maddeningly brief. It was far. It was wealthy. It had gold, ivory, lapis lazuli, exotic animals, and probably better food than the alluvium could ever produce. And yet, we still don't know where it was. Most theories plot Meluha somewhere in the Indus Valley, pointing to similarities in goods, seals, and trade timing, which would make it roughly the distance of several hundred nightmares away by boat, especially considering the average Mesopotamian ship was basically a floating reed basket held together by wishful thinking. Still, goods from Meluha, like etched carnelian beads and Harappan seals, do turn up in Mesopotamian sites, which suggests someone made the trip. Maybe multiple someones, regularly, for centuries. But then comes the more delicious problem. What language did Meluhan speak? Because unlike the Sumerians, Akkadians, or Elamites, Meluhans left behind zero decipherable writing in Mesopotamia. Not even a shopping list. Not a single, "Hey, thanks for the barley. Love, K." Which means they either spoke a language so alien no one even tried to write it down, or the scribes didn't bother to translate. Either way, Meluhans remained silent in the record, present in trade, absent in voice. Some speculate they used Harappan script, others suggest that maybe they just grunted and pointed at what they wanted. But considering how bureaucratic Mesopotamians were, the lack of recorded dialogue is suspicious. Did interpreters exist? Were the Meluhans polyglots? Or did they conduct business through ritual performance and mutual exhaustion? More tantalizing are the mentions of Meluhan settlers in Mesopotamian cities living in their own quarters, conducting trade, even needing translators. So they weren't just mythical merchants passing through, they lived there. Like expats from a land no one could find on a map, selling you lapis while politely refusing to explain their accent. And yet, Despite their footprint in trade and culture, meluha eventually disappears, vanishes from the tablets, stops sending ships, stops being referenced. Why? No one knows. Climate collapse? Civilization decline? Trade disruption? Alien abduction? Maybe meluha was never a fixed place at all, but a term for a shifting network of coastal traders, loosely unified by goods, but divided by dialects. Whatever the case, they left behind no language we can understand, no clear homeland we can visit, just silence, sealed in a jar of imported resin. But speaking of trade, you can't melt bronze dreams without tin, which leads us to the next great absence. Where the hell did all that tin come from? The primary sources of tin that fed Mesopotamian bronze. If you ever want to stress out an archaeometallurgist, just ask them. So, where did the Sumerians get their tin? Then watch their soul leave their body. You see, Mesopotamia had a problem. They wanted bronze, that glorious, durable, god-tier metal that made for sharper tools, shinier swords, and more dignified door fixtures. But bronze requires copper, easy, and tin, not so easy. Copper was everywhere, tin was not. Tin was somewhere else. But where exactly that somewhere remains one of the great Bronze Age mysteries, and we're not talking about a handful of ingots smuggled in a camel's saddlebag. We're talking tons of the stuff, arriving consistently for centuries, across regions with no local tin and no decent roads. Mesopotamian scribes, in their typical fashion, left us dozens of records about barley quotas and oxen feed, but almost nothing about the tin trade, as if they were deliberately trying to avoid explaining the logistical nightmare that kept their metallurgy running. Was it a state secret? A merchant's monopoly? Or just something so obvious to them it didn't warrant a footnote? One theory points eastward toward Iran, Afghanistan, even as far as Central Asia, places where tin occurs naturally and where ancient mining may have taken place. But here's the rub. We still haven't found a clear, continuous mining operation dating to the exact period when Sumerian bronze production was at its peak, just tantalizing traces and a lot of wishful thinking. Another candidate is Anatolia, to the north, which had known tin sources in the later Bronze Age, but again, the timing is off. We see trade from Anatolia in later periods, Hittites, Assyrians, but not clearly in the earliest Sumerian heyday. If Anatolia was shipping tin southward in 2500 BCE, they did so with ninja-like subtlety. And then, there's the long-shot theory, that the tin came from multiple microsources, small deposits exploited quietly and locally, combined through trade networks that blurred all origins. In this model, Mesopotamian bronze wasn't fed by one big mine, but by 1,000 forgotten pits, now eroded, plowed under, or simply lost to time. Either way, the logistical challenge remains staggering. Getting tin from the highlands of Iran or the Hindu Kush all the way to the floodplains of the Tigris-Euphrates required coordinated trade, massive effort, and probably a high body count. And for what? Tools, weapons, idols, plumbing, an entire culture forged in a metal that they themselves couldn't make without help. So yes, Sumerian civilization ran on borrowed ore, on invisible caravans, on trade routes we can't fully reconstruct. Their temples were built with the blood of miners they never met. Their kings crowned with alloys born in distant mountains. And we still don't know who did the hauling. Which is rich, considering how obsessed they were with logistics. Just look at their architectural pride and joy, the ziggurat. Now ask yourself, how exactly do you build a 90-foot mud brick mountain in a swamp? The engineering logistics for raising and maintaining mega ziggurats in mud brick at scale? Picture this, a 7-story mountain built not from stone, but from mud, not by the dozens, but by the thousands. And not as a one-off architectural stunt, but as a consistent regional style Mesopotamia's signature skyline for nearly 2,000 years. The ziggurat was no modest monument. It was an absurd undertaking, a pyramidal tower layered like a wedding cake, designed to elevate a shrine into the heavens. These were not merely temples, they were statements. And they were made, almost exclusively, of baked and unbaked mud brick. Let's pause there. Mud brick. The most high-maintenance building material known to man. Cheap, yes. Easy to make, sure. Durable? Not even slightly. Mud brick melts in rain. It cracks in heat. It erodes in wind. And yet, somehow, the Sumerians built entire vertical cities out of it. Which means someone had to figure out the logistics. First, there's the sheer volume. A single ziggurat like the one in Ur likely required hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of bricks. Each brick was hand-shaped, sun-dried or keyline fired if you were feeling fancy, stamped with an official seal, and transported upward via ramps, scaffolds, or divine levitation. Probably ramps. Then there's the labor. We're talking thousands of workers digging clay, hauling water, mixing straw, pressing molds, lifting loads, and occasionally falling off platforms. All overseen by temple administrators who measured every output in absurdly detailed units like brickman days and still couldn't explain where half the bricks went. Oh, and did we mention the foundations? Swamps don't make great real estate. Building a ziggurat meant draining, elevating, and reinforcing a site before you even stacked the first brick. You needed drainage channels, buttressed walls, bitumen linings, and probably at least one sacrificial goat to appease the local groundwater demons. Maintenance? Even worse. Ziggurats weren't static monuments. They required constant repairs. The outer layers eroded with every seasonal flood and windstorm. The mud brick had to be regularly patched, replastered, repainted. Some were even periodically buried and rebuilt from scratch, like hitting the architectural reset button because your sky staircase got soggy again. So why do it? Because the ziggurat wasn't just a temple. It was a claim, a visible axis between heaven and earth, a symbol of order, a projection of power, a controlled mountain in a flat world. Even the stairs were symbolic. They weren't for tourists. They were for gods. The priest would ascend alone, offerings in hand, to commune with the divine in an enclosed shrine at the top, usually covered in glazed tiles, precious metals, or just a really hopeful prayer that it wouldn't collapse. And somehow, it worked. The ziggurat became the icon of Mesopotamian architecture, and every time one started crumbling, another rose. But while the buildings rose, something else was developing in the mud. Writing. Or rather, its messier cousin, the thing that came before it. Full decoding of Protocuneiform numerals, metrology across competing city systems. Before Sumerian scribes were poets, they were bean counters. Protocuneiform writing, before writing, wasn't invented to tell stories. It was invented to track grain, and livestock, and labor quotas, and temple inventories. It was Excel spreadsheets carved into wet clay with the emotional range of a tax audit. But here's where it gets spicy. These early tablets weren't standardized. Each city-state had its own symbols, its own metrology, its own system of counting how many goats made a cow or how many shekels weighed a barley loaf. In other words, ancient Mesopotamia was less a unified civilization and more of a bureaucratic multiverse, where every city spoke a different dialect of math gibberish. Let's talk numerals. The Sumerians used base 60 for some things, base 10 for others, base 6 for still others. It's as if their accountants were given full creative freedom and no supervision. They had signs for units, tens, 60s, even fractional values, and none of it worked the same way across regions. One city might measure grain in gur, another in bareg, another in ban, with no consistent conversion rate unless you were a temple scribe with insider access to the secret chart. Then there were the tokens, little clay counters used before full writing emerged. A sheep? Use a cone. A bundle of reeds? Use a sphere. A temple offering? Use, well, no one knows anymore. That symbol might have meant 2 oxen or half a priest. Over time, these tokens got sealed into Bullae clay envelopes, like primitive accounting software with no interface. To read it, you smash the envelope open. Efficient? Not even slightly. Symbolic? Extremely. Eventually, someone had the bright idea to press the token shapes directly into clay, saving time and fingernails. From there, proto-writing was born. But the real trick came later, when symbols started to represent sounds, not just things. Language was crawling out of numbers. Still, we've barely cracked the system. Scholars today can only partially decipher Protocuneiform metrology. Every new tablet adds exceptions, rewrites the rules, and implies that ancient accountants were just winging it with enormous confidence. Which leaves us in a paradox. The first writing wasn't literature, it wasn't myth, it was math, and we don't understand it. Because before Gilgamesh, before the gods, before kings and epics and laws, there was a clerk staring at a pile of barley, trying to invent a system that no one outside his city would ever fully grasp. And that system gave birth to history. But how did those abstract clay scratches become actual words? To find that out, we have to witness the strangest cognitive leap in human history the moment pictures became phonetics. The stepwise leap from pictography to phonetic writing in uruk, what triggered it? Once upon a time in uruk, someone drew a picture of a fish, and it meant a fish. Simple, honest, direct. But then, someone drew that same fish, and suddenly it meant abundance, then silver, then wish, then it rhymed with a word for sun, then, without warning, it became a syllable in a priest's name. Congratulations, phonetic writing had arrived, and the fish was never just a fish again. This transformation from visual symbols to sounds is one of the most quietly bizarre developments in human history. 1 minute, your clay tablet is a list of grain. The next, it's a phonetic pun about a guy named Ku, who may or may not be part goat. The shift wasn't just linguistic, it was cognitive. Something snapped inside the human brain, and writing went from bookkeeping to abstraction. But the process was not instant, nor clean, nor even fully traceable. Protocuneiform began as pictographic notation around 3300 BCE, a cow for a cow, a jar for a jar. But over time, the symbols became less literal and more squiggly and more stylized, more wedge-shaped. A goat's head turned into a triangle with attitude. A sheaf of barley became 3 scratches and a prayer. Then came the real twist. Scribes began to use these symbols not for what they looked like, but for what they sounded like. A symbol for reed could stand in for the syllable g, in other words. Thus, the system hacked itself, using pictures as stand-ins for speech. This is known as the rebus principle, and it's how we ended up with clay tablets that could represent names, verbs, poetry, even legal arguments. All from a system originally designed to track grain rations and livestock casualties. But the question is, why? Why did the scribes of Uruk make this leap from pictograph to phonetic? What triggered it? What pressure made them turn inventory into ideology? Some theories suggest that administrative complexity forced their hand. As temple economies grew, so did the need for precision. It wasn't enough to say 5 sheep. Now you had to say 5 sheep promised to the goddess Inanna by Enlil-Z, son of Kubanda, on the 6th day of the barley festival. Try drawing that. Others believe it was about power, the temple elite realizing they could encode speech, names, commands. That writing could become speech without the speaker, a ghost of authority etched into clay. Or maybe it was just a game, a linguistic prank that got out of hand. A scribe bored with grain tallying who decided to invent puns in clay, and accidentally dragged humanity into the written era? We'll never know exactly, but we do know that once phonetic writing emerged, it never went back. Sumerian evolved, Akkadian joined the party, literature bloomed, law was codified, bureaucracy exploded. And through it all, one weird little king list appeared, listing names and dynasties from before the flood, including kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. Which brings us to the most suspicious timeline ever recorded in clay. Why Antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list have impossible lifespans? Meet Alulim, the first king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Yes, you read that correctly. 28,800 years. And he's not alone. The Sumerian king list, a clay tablet inscribed with the names of rulers from mythical prehistory to more recent, believable dynasties, opens with a roll call of kings who ruled for unhinged spans of time. One did 36,000 years. Another managed 43,200. A couple of slackers only managed 18,600. Together, they reigned longer than most species survive. These kings lived in the Antediluvian era before the flood, a sacred prehistory where human rulers and divine legitimacy blurred into one long fever dream of exaggerated chronology. After the flood, lifespans drop sharply. Suddenly, kings are clocking in at more believable terms, 25 years, 30, maybe 70, on a good run. So what gives? Was this a clerical error with too many zeros? A misunderstanding of time units? Or were the Sumerians just being sarcastic, writing an ancient version of "he's been king forever"? One theory is symbolic numerology. These exaggerated reigns often land on mathematically pleasing figures, multiples of 60, 600, or 3,600. Base 60 rears its ancient head again. It's possible these numbers weren't meant to be read literally, but cosmically. The king's reign corresponded to celestial cycles, mythic eras, or metaphysical truths. Another theory posits divine lineage. These early kings weren't fully human. They were semi-divine intermediaries, ruling during an age when gods walked the earth. Naturally, their reigns defy human lifespans, because they weren't governed by human limits. Or perhaps, more cynically, these numbers were political retrofitting, a later dynasty trying to look legitimate by retroactively gluing their name to an impossibly ancient line of rulers. See? My great-great-great-grandfather ruled for 43,000 years. Respect me. But here's the strangest part. The king list is selective. Some known rulers are excluded, others are downplayed. It's not just a history, it's a curated narrative, a propaganda scroll disguised as a time log. The numbers are part of the magic. And the flood, sitting in the middle like a divine punctuation mark, cleaves the timeline. Before the flood, myth. After the flood, monarchy. It's a reset button. A divine act that legitimizes everything after it by framing everything before it as legend. So maybe the Sumerians weren't stupid. Maybe they didn't believe those numbers literally. Maybe they just understood something. Modern readers forget that mythic time isn't about precision, it's about scale. Authority, awe, and awe is exactly what you feel when you read about a man who lived for 30,000 years and then disappeared in a flood. Speaking of floods, there's a story older than Noah, a flood that wrecked the world and left behind a lone survivor named Atrahasis. The question is, did it really happen? And where's the mud to prove it? The historical floods. Behind Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and which strata correspond? Before Noah built his boat, before rain fell for 40 days, before pairs of animals awkwardly filed in under divine threat, there was Atrahasis. He was the Mesopotamian original. A righteous man warned by a god to build a giant boat, survive a global flood, and repopulate the earth. His story predates the Hebrew version by over a millennium, and it appears in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim, and the gods seem vaguely embarrassed about the whole thing. So was it real? Did a massive flood wipe out early Mesopotamian civilization, leaving behind only a clay tablet and a lingering sense of cosmic guilt? Well, sort of. Maybe. It's complicated. Archaeologists have actually found flood layers, literal bands of silt and debris at sites like Kish, Shuruppak. These layers suggest severe local flooding sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE. A few feet of river mud, disrupting occupation layers, followed by rebuilding. Sounds promising, right? Except the flood layers don't align. They're not the same date, not the same depth, not even the same extent. Which implies not one apocalyptic deluge, but a bunch of smaller, catastrophic floods scattered across centuries. Think regional disasters, not global cleansing. So how did these become the flood? It's possible that memory consolidated over time. Multiple devastating floods, combined with oral storytelling, gradually merged into one epic deluge. Throw in a cranky pantheon, tired of humanity's noise and overpopulation, and you've got yourself a myth with teeth. But there's another possibility. The flood wasn't just about water. It was about resetting the moral order, a divine wipeout, an excuse to explain why kingship restarted, why the gods withdrew, why writing began again. And maybe that's the real power of the flood myth. It turns geological chaos into moral design. Mud as metaphor, silt as scripture. As for Atrahasis, he builds the ark, rides out the flood, makes a sacrifice, and receives immortality. Not bad for a guy whose neighbors probably mocked his boat until it floated over their rooftops. So yes, there were floods, real ones, disasters that shaped memory. But the story? That's something else. That's a myth so sticky it jumped continents, religions, and centuries. And in that myth, one name echoes louder than most: Gilgamesh. Half god, full ego, tragic king, and maybe, just maybe, a real man under all that heroic posturing. Whether Gilgamesh was a historical king, and what he actually did. It's tempting to say Gilgamesh was never real, that he was a poetic fever dream of Mesopotamian masculinity, part god, part tyrant, part existential crisis in a lion skin cape. After all, his story includes killing monsters, defying death, shouting at deities, and building walls so impressive they got their own prologue. But then you find his name on an ancient Sumerian king list, squeezed between more plausibly documented rulers, and suddenly the question gets weirder. What if Gilgamesh was real, but also a legend? What if history and myth didn't politely separate but merged into one contradictory clay tablet? Let's begin with what the records do say. Gilgamesh, or Bilgamesh in Sumerian, because of course even his name has an alternate version, appears as the 5th king of Uruk in the 1st dynasty, ruling sometime in the early 3rd millennium BCE. That's before the pyramids were finished, before Stonehenge got its first selfie. Deep prehistory. The Sumerian king list says he ruled for 126 years, which, while not 36,000, still pushes the boundaries of believable geriatrics. His father was a lilu, which could mean a spirit, a demon, or just someone with no documented taxes. Already, the line between man and myth is foggy. But more intriguingly, Gilgamesh shows up not just on king lists, but also in temple inventories, dedicatory texts, and building records. There's even a damaged tablet that references a wall built by him, possibly the wall around Uruk, which he brags about endlessly in the epic. Which means someone named Gilgamesh probably did exist. Probably ruled Uruk, possibly did urban planning, may have yelled at laborers about brick quality. So what did he actually do? Well, no reliable documents survive from his supposed reign. No treaties, no laws, just a cultural aftershock that grew louder over the centuries. By the time scribes wrote the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, he had become a tragic demigod obsessed with mortality, lamenting the loss of his wild man friend Enkidu, and screaming into the void about human frailty. The epic makes him both king and anti-king, hero and fool. He slays Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, in a colonial-style hit job that reads suspiciously like economic expansion. He kills the bull of heaven after rejecting a goddess's advances, which is a terrible way to handle rejection. And then he spirals into despair when Enkidu dies, beginning a metaphysical journey to escape death and learn how to live. It's brilliant literature. But is it biography? Possibly not. Possibly never. But the fact that Gilgamesh evolved from ruler to myth to moral puzzle tells us something deeper. That Sumerians were doing more than myth-making. They were remembering, but sideways. Preserving a name and building around it a myth of cosmic failure and human yearning. He might have ruled. He might have built a wall. He definitely became the prototype of the tragic hero, and his cry, "Shall I not die too?" still echoes. But if Gilgamesh was real, was his father or his grandfather? The line blurs further with Enmerkar and Lugalbanda, rulers, or were they, who show up in myths that feel more like origin stories than chronicles. If Enmerkar, Lugalbanda preserve real rulers or literary archetypes. Before Gilgamesh brooded his way into existential immortality, there were two other kings of Uruk who ruled the mythic pre-dynastic stage, like backlit theater characters caught between history and allegory. Enmerkar and Lugalbanda. Their names show up in Sumerian epics as confidently as if they were listed in a king's LinkedIn profile. Enmerkar, the founder, the builder, the man who allegedly invented writing because messengers kept forgetting their lines. Lugalbanda, the humble warrior priest who got stuck in a cave, prayed his way to god status, and may or may not have sprouted divine charisma from a migraine. Also, Gilgamesh's dad. Maybe. Possibly. Depends on the day. So, were these two men actual rulers? Or were they just figments of Sumerian myth-making, created to fill in the awkward silence before more historically verifiable monarchs showed up? Let's start with Enmerkar, whose name means Enmi-Urkar, or something close to priest king who built. His mythic exploits revolve around founding Uruk, constructing temples, and engaging in an increasingly absurd power struggle with a far-off place called Arata, which may or may not have existed. Don't worry, we'll get there soon. In the stories, Enmerkar is portrayed as a proto-bureaucrat, with an unfortunate flair for divine threats and passive-aggressive diplomacy. When his envoys fail to intimidate Arata's ruler, he literally invents writing to get his message across more clearly. Of course, the god Enki helps with this, because no technological leap in Mesopotamia is complete without divine product development. Does this mean Enmerkar invented writing? Of course not, but someone clearly wanted to tie literacy, kingship, and Uruk civic pride into one narrative bundle, and Enmerkar was the face they slapped on it. As for Lugalbanda, things get stranger. He stars in not one but two epics, Lugalbanda in the Mountain Cave and Lugalbanda and the Anzud Bird. In these tales he's part soldier, part saint, part reluctant hero trapped in a desert cave with a medical emergency and no Wi-Fi. He prays, he fasts, he receives divine visions, he gains supernatural speed, he befriends a giant bird, he becomes a god, or something like one. By the end, he's been transformed not by conquest or legislation, but by waiting, suffering, and divine attention. These aren't the stories of ordinary rulers. They're character arcs, templates, ideological blueprints. Enmerkar builds civilization. Lugalbanda becomes its spiritual conscience. Together, they set the mythic tone that Gilgamesh would later break apart in his existential midlife crisis. Do they appear in king lists? Yes. Do we have any direct archaeological proof of their reigns? Not really. No tablets, no inscriptions, just myths layered with meaning and sprinkled with state propaganda. So maybe they were real. Maybe they weren't. Or maybe they were remembered the way all-powerful figures hope to be remembered, as metaphors that endure long after the mud brick palace is gone. But while myths gestated in Uruk, something far more tangible was cracking apart. An empire. One that collapsed so hard we're still piecing together whether it was bad weather, bad politics, or something worse. The precise cocktail of causes. Behind the Akkadian Empire's collapse, 4.2 Ka, event, Gutians, finance. If Mesopotamia ever had a golden age that ended like a cautionary tale, it was the Akkadian Empire. Founded by Sargon of Akkad, the self-made king who rose from obscurity and conquered everything that looked remotely taxable, the Akkadian Empire was the first of its kind, a sprawling, centralized machine of war, administration, and creative accounting. It stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. It boasted roads, postal systems, taxation quotas, and standardized beer rations. And then, within a century or two, it all fell apart, hard. What caused the collapse? Short answer, everything. Long answer, a nightmare cocktail of bad climate, bad neighbors, bad spreadsheets, and perhaps a little divine spite sprinkled on top. Let's break it down. First ingredient, the 4.2 Ka event. Around 2200 BCE, climate records suggest a severe, prolonged drought hit the region. Rainfall plummeted, crops failed, rivers dried. Dust storms rolled through the Fertile Crescent with all the subtlety of a tax auditor. The agricultural surplus that powered the empire's administrative engine simply evaporated. No grain, no taxes. No taxes, no empire. Second ingredient, the Gutians. These mysterious highlanders from the Zagros Mountains appear in texts like a horror movie monster. Unpredictable, illiterate, and deeply resented by scribes. Akkadian sources portray them as savages who brought chaos, broke temples, and ruined everything with their failure to respect cuneiform bureaucracy. But did they actually invade en masse, or did they just fill the power vacuum after everything else imploded? Some argue they were less conquerors than opportunists, walking in after the plumbing failed and claiming they were in charge because no one else showed up to work. Third ingredient, financial overreach. The empire's administrative burden was massive. Every conquered city had to be managed, taxed, and supplied. Armies needed salaries. Temples needed gifts. Officials needed bribes. And if any part of the system broke, like, say, due to famine, the whole machine seized up. In a world without deficit spending, bankruptcy was literal. Fourth ingredient, revolt fatigue. You can only keep people loyal through fear and grain for so long. As the empire weakened, client states and subject cities likely began testing the limits of imperial patience. Some rebelled outright. Others simply stopped answering letters. When the center can't enforce, the periphery defects. Add all these together, and you don't get a collapse. You get a slow-motion unraveling, a whispering disintegration, cities abandoned, roads overgrown, records lost. And Akkad itself, Sargon's proud capital, eventually vanished, its ruins still undiscovered, like a final insult from history. And in the ruins, from the margins, a new mystery emerges. The Gutians themselves. Were they really the barbarians the scribes accused them of being, or just the next inconvenient chapter in Mesopotamian survival? Who the Gutians were language, homeland, political structure. If the Gutians had a publicist, they got a raw deal. Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe them with all the nuance of a rejected monster movie script. They were unintelligible, rude, hairy, and most damningly did not know how to revere the gods. A devastating insult in Mesopotamia, where spiritual competence was second only to proper irrigation. So who were these people? We know they came from the Zagros Mountains, a rugged range east of Mesopotamia, populated by tribes who were perpetually annoying to empires that liked things flat and taxable. The Gutians weren't a single kingdom, but likely a confederation of highland groups, tribes, clans, maybe local warlords. No coins, no writing, no monuments, just whispers in other people's clay. Their language? Unknown. Not Semitic, not Sumerian. No texts survive, and what little we know comes from personal names, which are often so mangled by scribes, it's like trying to learn French from a Scottish pirate. But they did become rulers of Mesopotamia for a while. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, Gutian kings show up in the Sumerian king list. Names like Inkishush and Sarlagab appear, holding power for years, sometimes decades. They weren't just looters, they governed. Poorly, according to their enemies. Texts claim they neglected temples, disrupted trade, let irrigation channels clog, and reduced cities to chaos. One lamentation reads like a Yelp review of a failing state. The Gutians could not speak properly. They didn't know the rights. They let the oxen wander. Devastating. But how accurate is that? Hard to say. Most surviving accounts come from later Sumerian rulers, who had every incentive to portray their predecessors as uncouth barbarians, so their own reign would seem like a return to cosmic order. It's possible the Gutians simply lacked the bureaucratic machinery of their predecessors. No writing equals no receipts equals no praise. Or maybe they ruled through local proxies, maintaining enough control to be recognized, but not enough to inspire poet-priests. Eventually, the Gutians were driven out by Utu Hegel of Uruk, who restored proper kingship, and then by the rise of Ur-3, a state that brought back temples, taxes, and the belief that the universe worked best when managed by obsessive scribes. And the Gutians faded back into the mountains, vanished from records, swallowed by the very landscape they emerged from. Which leaves us with a question. Were they destroyers, or just inconvenient placeholders in a myth of collapse and rebirth? Maybe both, maybe neither. But they had a follow-up act. Their brief rule wasn't the end, because someone had to try to govern the South, to manage a region still reeling from drought, collapse, and silence. Which brings us to the awkward, short-lived attempt to reboot the Mesopotamian state, Ur-3, and what a bureaucratic burnout that turned out to be. How the Gutians governed, if they did, in southern Mesopotamia. Let's say you're a highland raider. You've just inherited the burned-out remains of the world's first empire. The irrigation's failing, the scribes hate you, and half the temples look like the aftermath of a religious yard sale. Welcome to Gutian rule in southern Mesopotamia. The question isn't just what did the Gutians do, it's did they govern at all, or were they just squatting on the ruins, confused by canal maps and ignoring complaints about broken lunar calendars? On paper, well, on clay, the Gutians ruled for decades. Their kings appear in the Sumerian king list, albeit awkwardly wedged between real dynasties like a family secret no one wants to talk about. The list names multiple Gutian rulers, Inkishush, Yarlagab, Shulme, and others, suggesting some continuity, even succession. That implies structure, hierarchy, maybe even a tax form or two. But the literary evidence screams dysfunction. Sumerian scribes describe Gutian governance as an era of divine neglect and civic decay. Temples were abandoned, rituals forgotten, laws unenforced, livestock confused. The rivers, they say, no longer knew their banks. That's poetic code for the barbarians ruined our zoning laws. Of course, we should remember who wrote those tablets. The Gutians didn't leave written records. Everything we know comes from their enemies, and those enemies had a vested interest in exaggerating the chaos. It's political marketing 101. Paint your predecessors as uncultured chaos goblins, and you look like the divine solution. So let's entertain the unglamorous possibility. The Gutians tried to govern. Maybe not with tablets and scribes and temple spreadsheets, but with custom, local alliances, and improvised authority. Maybe they worked with city elites where possible. Maybe they appointed military overseers in place of priestly councils. Maybe they focused on tribute and manpower, leaving the rest to sort itself out. But without the ideological engine of the Mesopotamian state, without temple support, scribal propaganda, and a cosmic justification for kingship, they were never going to rule in the traditional sense. They were occupiers in a theocratic bureaucracy, and that never ends well. Eventually, southern cities began pushing back. Utu Hegel of Uruk, a nobody with a grudge and divine endorsement, claimed to defeat the Gutians and restore order. His successor, Ur-Nama, founded Ur III, a dynasty that basically rebranded Mesopotamia as an orderly temple theme park, with laws, canals, and perfectly aligned bricks. The Gutians, meanwhile, vanished. No epilogues, no memoirs, no legacy, unless you count being the cautionary tale scribes told their children when they didn't want to study Akkadian declensions. So did the Gutians govern? Maybe, briefly, in their own way. But without written records, their rule is like a shadow cast by someone else's torch, seen only in distortion, remembered only in complaint. And that's just one reason why Ur III's collapse is so unnerving. Because even when the scribes are on your side, even when you do everything right, Mesopotamia still eats its kings. Why the Ur III state unraveled so quickly? Climate, invasion, debt, bureaucracy. Imagine spending decades rebuilding an empire after total collapse, only to watch it crumble again like a badly mixed mud brick. That's the story of the Ur III state, the ancient equivalent of pressing restart civilization and discovering the bugs never got patched. Founded by Ur-Nama around 2112 BCE, give or take a goat census, Ur III was a conscious effort to restore order, glory, and properly itemized sacrifice lists to Sumer. It was a bureaucrat's dream: centralized planning, detailed taxation, rigid temple administration, standardized measurements. Everyone had a job. Everyone had an account number. It was also the most spreadsheet-obsessed regime the world had yet seen. And for a time, it worked. Cities were rebuilt, trade resumed, art and literature flourished, kings ruled with divine backing and a healthy respect for audit procedures. Ur III was clean, rational, and impressive, until it wasn't. So what went wrong? First, the climate struck again. The 4.2 Ka event didn't just vanish after collapsing Akkad. The region was still recovering, and agricultural pressure never fully eased. Salinization from over-irrigation turned fertile fields into white-crusted wastelands. Barley yields dropped, population shifted, farmers fled to cities, and cities, famously, cannot be farmed. Second, the system itself became top-heavy. Ur III's centralized control was brutally efficient until local conditions changed. Then it was brutally rigid. Every labor contract, land plot, and sheep count had to pass through temple scribes. And when crisis hit, the state couldn't adapt. Bureaucracies don't pivot. They file complaints in triplicate. Third, debt. The very success of Ur III's system led to widespread indebtedness. Smallholders lost land. Peasants mortgaged their futures. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, the last king, debt amnesties were issued like confetti, desperate attempts to reset an economy choking on its own rules. And then came the Amorites. Whether they were invaders, migrants, or disgruntled neighbors with a better sense of timing, the Amorites began pressing in from the west, destabilizing the edges of the empire. The Elamites joined in from the east, and suddenly, Ur III's once proud bureaucracy was reduced to begging allies for grain and weapons. By the end, Ibbi-Sin was a king in name only, holed up in a crumbling city while the countryside slipped away. One inscription has him pleading for help like a Mesopotamian HR complaint. "Send provisions, the people are dying." History, unsurprisingly, did not respond. So the Ur III state didn't fall with a bang. It unraveled, like a tablet left out in the rain, slowly, inevitably. And it proved that even the most well-planned civilization can be undone by salt, spreadsheets, and semi-nomadic neighbors with decent timing. Speaking of neighbors, where exactly did those Amorites come from? And how did they get so good at walking into collapsing kingdoms like they owned the place? The Amorites, exact homeland and migration routes into the alluvium. If the Gutians were the mountain men who ruled from the shadows, the Amorites were the desert whisperers who moved in when the doors were left open. For centuries, they drifted on the edge of Mesopotamian vision, semi-nomadic, elusive, unsettlingly organized, not quite foreign, not quite local. Some scribes described them as outsiders with questionable hygiene and a disturbing lack of temple etiquette. Others married them and handed over cities. So where did they come from? Broadly, the Amorites hailed from the west, likely the semi-arid steppe regions of modern-day Syria. That much is clear. But specifics? Still murky. They weren't a unified people. They didn't build kingdoms at first. They moved in waves, in family-based tribal units, following grazing routes, trade paths, and political vacuums. They appear in Mesopotamian texts around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, right when things were falling apart. Coincidence? Probably not. Some tablets complain of a Muru infiltrating farmlands. Others list Amorite chieftains among military commanders, governors, or even palace officials. One day they're unwanted migrants. The next, they're running the show. But how did they get there? It wasn't one invasion. It was a slow-motion migration. Amorite clans moved east over decades, some peacefully, settling as farmers and herders. Others more forcefully, taking advantage of collapsing cities, fractured states, and open frontiers. As Ur-3 faltered, they slipped into power like water into cracked clay. Eventually, some Amorites founded dynasties like the one in Babylon. Yes, that Babylon. That's right. The future capital of Hammurabi and theological drama was originally a backwater Amorite outpost. So much for barbarians. The Amorites spoke a Semitic language, close to Akkadian but distinct. They brought their own names, gods, and legal customs, and they adapted fast. Within a few generations, Amorite rulers were speaking Akkadian, commissioning scribes, and issuing laws so civilized they'd make Ur-Namma blush. Still, their origins remain frustratingly vague. There's no Amorite homeland in clear archaeological focus. No grand capital, no central shrine. Just a constellation of tribal names, mythic lineages, and migration trails. Maybe that was the point. The Amorites weren't about founding cities, they were about becoming part of cities. Embedded, reframed, rebranded. And their ascent raises a deeper question. Did they take over Mesopotamia, or did Mesopotamia absorb them? Maybe both. Maybe every fall of empire is just a changing of the guard, with the next rulers already living quietly in the suburbs, waiting for the rent to lapse. And while they spread across the plains, one mythic tower still rose in memory. Etemenanki, the ziggurat to end all ziggurats, a real building, a cosmic staircase? Or the original cause of multilingual headaches? The dimensions, form, and cult role of Etemenanki, the Tower of Babel problem. Take every ziggurat ever built, throw gold at it, slap on a divine warranty, and you get Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, a name that modestly implies it held up both the sky and the dirt. This was Babylon's big flex, a massive, stepped tower rising so high that ancient visitors probably couldn't tell whether they were approaching a temple or an interdimensional staircase. Later generations would call it the Tower of Babel, and then blame it for everything from linguistic diversity to urban zoning failures. But here's the mystery. We don't know exactly what it looked like. Not really. Ancient texts describe it in dizzying terms. At its peak under Nebuchadnezzar II, it was supposedly 7 levels tall, standing over 90 meters high, nearly 300 feet. That's about a 30-story building made of mud brick, a material that erodes if you whisper rain at it. They supposedly coated it with glazed tiles, faced it with baked brick, and reinforced it with enough bitumen to waterproof a small country. But the physical evidence? Spotty. The base of Etemenanke may have been excavated, but all we've got left is a few crumbling foundations and the world's saddest pile of bricks. Most of what we know comes from later sources: Babylonian cuneiform, Greek historians, and biblical rumors filtered through at least 3 empires. And that brings us to the cult function. Etemenanke wasn't just architectural showing off. It was tied directly to the cult of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. At its summit, there was supposedly a shrine, a small temple where the god could descend, rest, and, one assumes, complain about the humidity. Some sources claim it even had a bed and a table of gold divine Airbnb, Mesopotamian edition. But no one, not priests, not pilgrims, not kings, was allowed up there unless they were very special, and even then, it's unclear whether the god actually used the space or if it was a symbolic real estate listing. So what was Etemenanke really for? Was it a temple? An observatory? A cosmic metaphor? All of the above? It was certainly symbolic geography. A mountain in the flat Babylonian plain, built by humans to invite the divine downward. A physical axis mundi. A staged recreation of the cosmic order, each level mirroring celestial realms, each stairway a ritual ascent. But it's also possible that Etemenanke was more feared than understood. The biblical story of Babel presents it as hubris, a human attempt to reach heaven, punished by divine sabotage. The Mesopotamians themselves seemed to treat it with a mix of reverence and anxiety. Even Alexander the Great tried to rebuild it, and then gave up. So what we're left with is an empty platform, both literal and symbolic, a monument whose form inspired legends, but whose details are permanently blurred by erosion, politics, and divine ambiguity. The true location of the Hanging Gardens, Babylon, Nineveh, or nowhere, somewhere between architectural marvel and geographical gaslighting, sits one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Famous for their soaring terraces, lush greenery, and miraculous engineering, they were described as a place where plants defied gravity, water climbed uphill, and kings tried to impress homesick wives by building entire mountain jungles in the desert. The problem is, we can't find them. And that's not just embarrassing. It's suspicious. According to the classical sources, chiefly Greek historians who loved a good exaggeration, these gardens were constructed by Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE for his Median queen, who missed the mountains of her homeland. Babylon, being an alluvial pancake with no elevation higher than a particularly ambitious mud brick, required the king to build a stepped ziggurat of greenery, complete with pumping systems, hanging vines, and tiered terraces. It was stunning, majestic, unparalleled. Also, possibly completely fictional. Because here's the kicker. No Babylonian texts mention them. Not one. Nebuchadnezzar left behind thousands of inscriptions boasting about his building projects, walls, temples, canals, even his bricks, but not a single word about the Hanging Gardens. Either he had a rare bout of humility, or they weren't there. Archaeologists, too, have scoured Babylon's ruins. They found palaces, temples, defensive walls thicker than most apartment complexes, but no garden terraces, no massive irrigation systems, no evidence of engineered slopes. Nothing that matches the wonder described. So where does that leave us? Well, some scholars think we've been looking in the wrong city entirely. Enter Nineveh, the Assyrian capital to the north. In the 7th century BCE, King Sennacherib, a man not known for understatement, described constructing a wonder for all peoples in his royal gardens, complete with aqueducts, canals, and a device that sounds suspiciously like a screw-based irrigation system. He even boasted of diverting an entire river to power his waterworks. Sound familiar? Unlike Babylon, Nineveh has textual bragging rights and archaeological remains, aqueduct ruins, stone channels, foundations of terraced gardens. It looks the part. And Sennacherib was absolutely the kind of ruler who would demand that his gardeners defy nature with architecture. So maybe the Greeks writing centuries later confused Babylon's fame with Nineveh's engineering. Or maybe the gardens did exist in Babylon once, but were destroyed and forgotten before the scribes could wax poetic about them. Or maybe, and this is the academic panic button, they never existed. A literary invention, born of hearsay, symbolic longing, and the irresistible urge to imagine paradise where it shouldn't be. The Hanging Gardens might be the ancient world's best game of telephone, an idea passed from scribe to tourist to historian until fiction became fact. Babylon, Nineveh, or nowhere at all? We may never know. The evidence is scattered, the ruins are mute, and the legend keeps blooming. But at least those gardens were trying to be symbolic. What about those tiny, rolling artworks that seemed to show myths, rituals, and tea parties but were used for signing paperwork? Let's roll right back into the maddening world of cylinder seals. What many cylinder seal scenes actually depict mythic liturgy, contracts, or office life? In the bureaucratic fever dream of Mesopotamia, cylinder seals were the ancient world's answer to passwords, signatures, Idaho cards, and somehow art installations. Carved into stone with mind-numbing precision, these tiny rollers weren't just for leaving impressions on wet clay. They were mini soap operas, mythic tableaus, and status flexes, compact, encrypted dioramas that screamed, "I have authority, a god on my side, and possibly 6 oxen in escrow." But the central mystery remains. What are these scenes actually depicting? Unraveling their meaning is like trying to interpret your boss's dreams based solely on their handwriting. On one seal, we see a figure being led by a robed attendant toward a seated god with a horned crown classic. In another, a naked hero wrestles 2 lions. Elsewhere, there's a banquet scene, a worship scene, a scene where everyone's raising their hands like they just lost a bar fight in slow motion. Were these actual mythic events, sacred liturgy, stylized representations of contracts, or just Sumerian graphic design gone rogue? Let's begin with the most literal interpretation. They're stories, myths, episodes from religious narratives that were well known at the time but now survive only in fragments. Take the common motif of the seated deity flanked by humans. Some interpret this as a visual retelling of divine audience scenes, moments when mortals stood before gods to receive blessings, instructions, or just the worst performance review of their lives. In this view, seals serve as visual theology. The bearer wasn't just authenticating documents, they were aligning themselves with cosmic order. Their seal told the world who they worshipped, what side of the divine hierarchy they belonged to, and perhaps which deity would smite their enemies if negotiations went south. But there's a catch. Many scenes repeat with little variation, even across centuries and regions. If they were literal storytelling devices, we'd expect more diversity, more evolution. Instead, we get the same poses, same layouts, same ambiguous expressions. It's like watching reruns of a show you've never seen from the middle of the season. That's where the contractual theory steps in. Some scholars argue these scenes were ritual shorthand, visual formulae that indicated the sanctity of the transaction. Much like how we might use a corporate logo to stamp legal documents, Mesopotamians rolled divine imagery onto clay to remind everyone, this contract isn't just binding, it's cosmic. Break the terms, and you're not just liable, you're cursed. There's also a more cynical view. Seals were office bling. Personalized status tokens that said, I'm important, literate, and possibly dangerous with spreadsheets. The scenes didn't need to be specific. They just needed to look official. A hero strangling a lion? Sure. A god dispensing justice? Why not? It's all part of the brand. And then there's the meta-interpretation. that the seals are deliberately opaque, designed to be recognized but not read. Like a modern logo, they weren't meant to tell a story so much as signal identity, a curated mythic self-image cast in stone and rolled across time. Still, the same haunting question lingers. Did anyone really understand all of this? Or were scribes and seal carvers just mimicking inherited iconography, pressing the same divine scenes because it was tradition, because nobody wanted to be the first guy to ask, wait, who is that? How Bullae and token accounting really worked right. Before writing standardized, before writing was writing before cuneiform, carved out its syllables, and Sumerian accountants achieved immortality through ledgers, there was the Bullae and the token, an incomprehensible economic ritual disguised as math. Imagine a world without letters, without numbers, without even pictograms. Now imagine trying to run a temple economy where people are constantly borrowing goats, trading grain, and demanding receipts. Welcome to the pre-literate administrative nightmare of Uruk, circa 3500 BCE. To solve this, the ancients invented a clever system. Small clay tokens in different shapes, each representing a commodity. A cone might mean 1 sheep, a sphere might mean 10 jars of oil, a tetrahedron? Who knows? Probably a lot of fish, or please stop asking. These tokens were stored in hollow Bullae clay envelopes that sealed the transaction. You'd place your tokens inside, stamp the outside with your seal, and then fire the whole thing like a financial piñata. If someone wanted to verify the deal, they'd break it open, count the tokens, and check if the seal matched. If it didn't, congratulations, you just committed Mesopotamian fraud. It's brilliant and maddening, because instead of writing 10 goats from farmer Enlobani, you carried around a clay egg full of abstract symbols and hoped no one needed to double-check. Eventually, they began pressing the token shapes directly into the outside of the Bullae, essentially inventing the concept of external labeling. Then they realized you could skip the tokens entirely and just impress the symbols into flat tablets. Voila, Protocuneiform. Writing was born not from literature or law, but from the desperate need to remember who owed what to whom. But even in its early phase, the Bullae system was incredibly sophisticated. Some tokens represented specific units, others, abstract categories. Some combinations implied ratios or relationships. It wasn't just counting, it was modeling. Like algebra made of Play-Doh. And they weren't just for temple economics. Some scholars believe Bullae were used in private contracts, marriage dowries, even religious offerings. Wherever people needed to agree on an exchange and avoid getting cheated, the Bullae stepped in like an ancient notary. But no writing system survives long without standardization. And as soon as cities began trading across distances, the tokens became insufficient. You can't model complex grain quotas or deferred loans with 6 cones and a pebble. So, tokens were left behind, Bullae cracked and discarded. And the scribes, those proto-accountants of the divine, began scratching marks into clay line by line, symbol by symbol, turning economics into language. But here's the kicker. We still don't know the full range of what Bullae were used for. Their codes remain partially undeciphered. Their logic is only half reconstructed. They are the ghosts of contracts, the ancestors of bureaucracy. And when the scribes realized that clay could capture more than math when symbols leapt from quantities to commands, declarations, literature, that's when the world really changed. Which raises a curious question. Why did writing suddenly explode beyond accounting at all? Why? Writing leapt from temple accounting to broad administrative literacy. Let's rewind to the quiet, clay-covered beginnings of writing, when its sole purpose was to make sure the temple didn't forget where it put its goats. Nothing poetic, no drama, just grain tallies, labor quotas, and passive-aggressive notes about fish deliveries. Writing was a divine tool for divine bean counting. So, how did it make the leap from sacred inventory management to full-blown administrative literacy with scribes tracking lawsuits, boundary disputes, land transfers, political speeches, and eventually epic poetry? Why did a system designed to prevent embezzlement suddenly start telling stories? The first answer is simple. Scale broke the system. Early temple economies were small, localized, and centrally controlled. You had a few dozen priests, a flock of workers, a few scribes, and a manageable number of goats. A pictogram here, a tally there, it was fine. But then cities got bigger, the population exploded, trade routes stretched across deserts, politics got messy, multiple institutions, palaces, temples, merchant houses started competing, cooperating, or suing each other. Suddenly, 3 tablets and a prayer didn't cut it. You needed a paper trail, not a guess. Enter administrative literacy, a quiet revolution that saw writing escape the temple walls and infect the rest of the city like divine red tape. Now merchants needed scribes, landowners needed scribes, even tax farmers needed scribes, especially tax farmers. Literacy became a tool of survival. If your neighbor forged a clay deed saying your date orchard belonged to him, you'd better be able to produce your version signed, sealed, and probably backed by at least one minor deity. But it wasn't just legal paranoia. Politics played a role too. Kings realized they could broadcast commands in writing, not just rely on loud heralds with good posture. Laws were inscribed in stone. Treaties were drafted. Propaganda went from oral tales to permanent records. Even curses were immortalized, because nothing says eternal grudge like inscribing a hex in basalt. So writing leapt from sacred utility to social infrastructure. It became the thread that tied together labor systems, taxation, justice, trade, and governance. It created a world where everything had to be logged, stamped, witnessed, and archived until the heat death of the universe or a minor flood. And then came the poets, the myth makers, the kings with delusions of immortality. Once scribes had a full toolkit, they started pushing boundaries. Myths were recorded, epics composed, divine genealogies inscribed. Bureaucracy gave birth to literature because, eventually, even scribes needed a break from sheep counts. But remember, all of this sprang from something deeply mundane. Barley rations, debt receipts, clay contracts for temple offerings. The sacred gave birth to the bureaucratic gave birth to the literary, and somewhere along the way, the gods took a back seat to the administrators. Still, not everything was written in soft clay. Some things were carved into rock so hard that modern tools barely scratch it. Which raises the next mystery: who in their right mind carved statues out of diorite, and more importantly, how did they get it to Lagash? Where Gudea's diorite came from, and how it was transported to Lagash. Meet Gudea, the pious ruler of Lagash, king of calm poses, patron of temples, and collector of ridiculously heavy statues. His legacy is as hard as the stone he chose to be immortalized in diorite, a material so unforgiving that even modern tools groan at the thought of carving it. And yet, Gudea had over a dozen statues of himself carved from this geological overachiever. He didn't just want to be remembered, he wanted to be unerodibly remembered. But here's the puzzle. Mesopotamia had no diorite. None. Zip. The land between the rivers is rich in silt, clay, and bureaucracy. But when it comes to hard stone, it's bankrupt. So where did this impossibly tough rock come from? The leading theories point to the Oman Mountains, possibly Iran, or maybe as far afield as Pakistan. The source is never explicitly named in the texts, but the Gudea inscriptions speak cryptically of mountains where diorite lies and of sending expeditions to fetch it. But that's just the beginning of the headache. How do you move tons of raw diorite from a remote, mountainous region hundreds of miles away across rivers, deserts, and marshes? There were no cranes, no forklifts, no reliable roads, just oxen, sledges, boats, and a lot of yelling. Some scholars imagine massive caravans, with draft animals dragging the stone overland in a painfully slow process. Others favor a maritime route, transporting it by boat along rivers and coastal routes, stopping at trading hubs like Dilmun or Maggan, before floating the massive cargo up the Euphrates and its canals. And then once it finally arrived, it still had to be carved. Diorite is nearly unworkable. It's not forgiving like limestone or soft like alabaster. Carving it meant patience, precision, and a workshop full of artisans willing to go blind from the effort. Every chisel mark was a minor miracle. So why go through all this trouble? Because diorite was a symbol. It was a message. I, Gudea, ruler of Lagash, am pious enough to build temples for the gods, rich enough to import luxury stone, and stubborn enough to get myself carved into an indestructible rock 15 times. It wasn't just durability, it was prestige. Diorite was exotic, rare, and eye-wateringly expensive. To own it was to broadcast power. To shape it into divine likeness was to say, my rule is as unyielding as the stone itself. And maybe that's what Gudea wanted. Not a statue, a time capsule, something to outlive the mud brick walls, the floods, the scribes, and the forgetfulness of future kings. But before that diorite could reach Lagash, it had to travel through the arteries of Bronze Age trade by boat, across unpredictable waters, in seasons that could make or break an empire's economy. Which begs the next mystery. What kinds of boats carried civilization back and forth across the Gulf? The boat types, capacities, and sailing seasons for Gulf trade to Dilmun, Maggan, Meluha. The waters of the Persian Gulf were the ancient Silk Road, before silk, before roads, and long before anyone agreed on what seaworthy meant. In the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian merchants were already conducting long-distance trade by boat, ferrying goods like copper, timber, lapis lazuli, and of course, the occasional diplomatic headache between Mesopotamia, Dilmun, Maggan, and Meluha. But what were they sailing? Well, not much has survived. No wrecks, no detailed blueprints, just hints and texts, and a few suggestive models. Still, we can piece together some of the picture. Boats came in various types, from humble river canoes to full-on sea vessels, with cargo holds, wooden planks, and bitumen caulking thick enough to survive a minor god's tantrum. The riverboats built from bundled reeds and slathered in tar were great for local travel, but terrible for open sea. For the Gulf, merchants likely used plank-built ships, constructed with timber imported from regions like Lebanon or Dilmun, stitched together with palm fiber ropes and reinforced with beams and clever prayer. These ships could carry dozens of tons of cargo, enough to float substantial hauls of copper from Maggan or jars of date syrup from Dilmun. Some inscriptions suggest capacities in the range of 10 to 30 tons, depending on hull design and the confidence level of the captain. As for sailing seasons, timing was everything. Gulf trade depended on wind patterns, particularly the shamal, a northwesterly wind that could either help or annihilate your voyage depending on the month. Most voyages took place during calmer summer months, when weather was more predictable and sandstorms less eager to play demolition derby with your mast. Merchants had to coordinate departures carefully, taking into account tide, wind, and destination festival calendars, because nothing says awkward like arriving in Dilmun mid-holiday with 20 tons of perishable goods and no dock space. The routes themselves likely hugged coastlines when possible, allowing ships to stop, resupply, and avoid open water. Ports like Eridu, and Lagash would have funneled goods southward, where they connected with Gulf networks that linked Mesopotamia to the broader Indian Ocean world. But here's the strange part. For all this trade, massive, consistent, and world-shaping, we have almost no visual depictions of the boats themselves. No heroic reliefs, no clay models. Just text that mentioned ships as if they were obvious background elements, like donkeys or sky. It's as if the boats were invisible infrastructure, ubiquitous, essential, but beneath artistic notice. And yet, these anonymous vessels were the lifeblood of Bronze Age commerce. They carried kings' demands, temples' luxuries, and scribes' carefully packed tablets. They linked cities with foreign lands that were equal parts real and mythic. And sometimes, they sailed to places that may not have even existed at all. Like Arata, a city of riches, mystery, and divine pettiness so potent it might never have been real, except to the kings who desperately needed it to be. The identity and location of Arata in Sumerian epics. In the grand tradition of ancient cities that sound just a little too good to be true, Arata holds a special place. Described in Sumerian epics as a land of untouched splendor, rich in gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and rhetorical overconfidence, Arata wasn't just a trade partner. It was a mythic foil, a spiritual rival, and an economic inconvenience. Mostly, though, it was a plot device wrapped in mystery. We first meet Arata in the Epic of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, where the proud king of Uruk demands submission from a distant city he's never seen, full of resources he cannot access, and ruled by a local lord who responds with the ancient equivalent of New Scroll, Hudis. It's a tale of messengers, magical incantations, divine interventions, and elaborate back-and-forth diplomacy. Enmerkar sends word that Inanna, goddess of war, favor, and ambiguity, has chosen Uruk over Arata. Arata replies, "Oh, really? Prove it." This goes on for a while, escalating, posturing, bargaining, until the gods get tired and the narrative fades out without a satisfying conclusion. So where was Arata? That's the million-shekel question. The texts say it was far away, over 7 mountain ranges, across treacherous terrain, reachable only through divine help or deeply impractical courier services. It was not part of the Mesopotamian alluvium, that much is clear. It was exotic, elevated, and entirely other. Some scholars have suggested Iran, perhaps the Zagros Mountains or beyond. Others point eastward, toward Bactria or Baluchistan regions rich in minerals and mystery and conveniently hard to excavate. But no archaeological site has ever stood up and confidently shouted, "Hi, I'm Arata." No inscriptions, no city ruins, just a ghost made of gold and literary tension. And maybe that's the point. Arata wasn't just a rival kingdom. It was a metaphor, a mirror held up to Uruk's rising ego. It represented the world beyond the floodplain, the dangerous, wealthy, spiritually potent wilderness that had to be symbolically tamed. Uruk was the city of writing, walls, and temples. Arata was the city of divine mystery, raw materials, and defiant independence. The epics don't describe Arata being conquered. Not really. Enmerkar doesn't ride in on a chariot and torch the place. Instead, the story ends with uneasy submission. Arata sends tribute. A temple is built, but the Lord of Arata remains. The Lord of Arata. It's as if the Sumerians couldn't quite bring themselves to erase this rival from the page. Which adds to the suspicion, did Arata ever exist at all? Was it a real city, exaggerated into myth? A myth eventually assumed to be real? Or a literary construct used to justify Uruk's divine right to dominate the world through trade, intimidation, and temple receipts? What we're left with is a name with weight, but no footprint. A myth that feels like memory, but refuses to manifest. A place real enough to inspire poems, but not real enough to find. And that's the strange beauty of Mesopotamian geography. It's never just coordinates. It's always cosmogony. But to place Arata in time, we'd need to know when anything happened, which is awkward. Because when it comes to Mesopotamian chronology, we've got 3 conflicting systems and no idea who's right. The absolute chronology of the Old Babylonian period, high versus middle versus low. In most historical timelines, dates are supposed to be helpful, anchors in time. Simple statements like, "This happened in 1750 BCE," which you can then forget about until someone in a museum asks you to feel reverence for it. Mesopotamia, however, doesn't do simple. Instead, it offers three overlapping, contradictory, and occasionally infuriating timelines for its Old Babylonian period: high chronology, middle chronology, and low chronology. Like a choose-your-own-adventure, where every choice leads to academic fistfights. Let's say you're trying to date the reign of Hammurabi, the most famous Amorite king of Babylon, best known for his legal code and spectacular beard. Was he ruling in 1848 BCE, high? 1792 BCE, middle? 1728 BCE, low? Depends on which scholarly team you ask, or which astronomical event you decide was observed correctly on a cloudy night 4,000 years ago. The problem isn't a lack of data. It's too much and not enough agreement. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't date events using fixed years. Instead, they named years after big happenings. Year Uruk was defeated, year the canal was dredged, year Enlil finally answered our emails. This was great for remembering order, but terrible for calculating actual years, especially once you lose track of how long a king ruled or forget who cleaned which canal. So modern historians have tried to back-calculate using astronomical references, particularly the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, which describes the risings and settings of Venus during his reign. The idea is simple. Match the recorded Venus cycles to actual celestial data, and you get a fixed date. Except the Venus cycles repeat every 8 years, and clouds exist, and copyists weren't always reliable. So you get multiple best fits, each of which births a separate chronology. High chronology: Hammurabi dies in 1806 BCE. Middle: 1750 BCE. Low: 1696 BCE. Each date shifts the entire Bronze Age timeline forward or backward, like someone hit snooze on history. And it's not just Hammurabi. Every event connected to him, treaties, battles, city falls, trade shifts, slides around depending on which timeline you prefer. It's like trying to build a puzzle where every piece keeps changing shape depending on your mood. To this day, scholars bicker about which system is correct. Most prefer the middle chronology, a grudging compromise, but no one can prove it definitively. Every new excavation, tablet, or astronomical recalibration threatens to shift the whole timeline again. So why does it matter? Because without a fixed chronology, causality collapses. Was Babylon rising when Mari fell? Did Hammurabi's wars coincide with Elamite invasions? Was that canal dredged before or after the flood? We don't know. We guess, we argue, and we redraw the timeline every few decades, like ancient historians playing cosmic Sudoku. But if Venus can't save us, maybe mathematics can. Which brings us to the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa itself, and the weird realization that ancient Mesopotamians might have known more about astronomy than we're ready to admit. Which astronomical solution for the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa is correct? It's one of the oldest sky diaries ever found. A clay tablet, faded and fractured, tracking the rise and set of Venus over a 21-year period during the reign of King Ammisaduqa, a Babylonian ruler whose name is harder to remember than his astronomer's legacy. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa doesn't just catalog pretty sunsets. It records when Venus appeared and disappeared from the night sky, and for how many days. The ancient scribes weren't trying to write poetry. They were trying to predict omens. Because in Mesopotamia, if Venus vanished for too long, it might mean your army would, too. But buried inside all that superstition is something tantalizing. Data. Cold, celestial, mathematical data. And modern historians saw it and said, "We can date history with this." That was the dream. Take those 21 years of Venus observations, match them to actual astronomical patterns, and you'd have a concrete timestamp, an anchor point in the swamp of Mesopotamian chronology. No more guessing when Hammurabi ruled. No more arguing about whether Mari fell before or after Babylon rose. No more picking between high, middle, or low chronologies like academic tarot cards. Just science, astronomy, certainty. So, naturally, it all fell apart. Because the Venus tablet is a mess. The observations are riddled with inconsistencies. Some values make sense, others don't. Dates jump around. Visibility periods are off. And then there's the fact that Venus has this nasty habit of repeating its cycles every 8 years, which means multiple timeframes in history could match the recorded patterns, at least loosely. This leaves us with several proposed solutions, each one passionately defended and roundly criticized by rival scholars. The high chronology places Ammisaduka's reign around 1702 BCE, pushing Hammurabi and friends earlier. The middle chronology slots it around 1646 BCE, currently the most popular compromise. The low chronology puts it around 1582 BCE, dragging the entire Old Babylonian period closer to the Late Bronze Age. And then there's the ultra-low chronology, which exists mostly to make everyone else uncomfortable. Each model uses Venus's risings and settings, adjusted for visibility and cloud interference, then factored through Babylonian lunar calendars, intercalary months, and human error because the ancient scribes weren't using telescopes. They were probably just squinting at the sky between accounting shifts and hoping Venus didn't ruin the barley crop. Some modern reconstructions even attempt to model atmospheric dust and refraction, trying to explain why the recorded data is slightly off. Others simply throw up their hands and say, "It's all symbolic. Stop trying to make science out of omens." And maybe they're right. Because the Venus tablet isn't just about astronomy. It's about divination trying to see the future in the stars. It's less about measuring Venus and more about reading her like a divine mood ring. Still, the numbers remain. The cycles, the patterns, the stubborn refusal of the planet to follow human calendars. Which leaves us with no certainty, just possibilities. The tablet, like so much else in Mesopotamia, refuses to settle down. It gives just enough information to inspire confidence and just enough contradictions to destroy it. So, what was it really for? Astronomy? Prophecy? Calendar alignment? Or was it all just an elaborate excuse to explain why the king's campaign failed again? Whatever the answer, it wouldn't be the last time Babylonian math made modern scholars question everything, especially when someone dug up a strange little tablet called Plimpton 322, a wedge-shaped piece of clay that might be the oldest trigonometry table in the world, or not. Why Plimpton 322 was compiled trigonometry, survey planning, or a teacher's key. It's small, it's cracked, it's dusty, and it has caused more mathematical shouting matches than any other artifact since someone first divided by zero. Meet Plimpton 322, a humble clay tablet filled with numbers arranged in neatly inscribed columns. At first glance, it looks like yet another example of Babylonian number crunching. Base 60 scribblings meant to track something mundane, like grain rations or roof tile quotas. But then someone realized the numbers weren't just random. They followed a pattern, a very specific pattern. A pattern that seemed to mirror something shockingly advanced, something Greek, modern, and impossibly ahead of its time: trigonometry. More precisely, the tablet contains a list of Pythagorean triple sets of numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared bc. In other words, it's recording the relationships between the sides of right-angled triangles, hundreds of years before Pythagoras was even born. Which is awkward, because he's usually the guy we give credit for inventing that particular trick. So how did this get here? Some scholars believe Plimpton 322 was a mathematical table designed to help with architectural planning, surveying, or construction. Ancient scribes and engineers had to deal with land division, temple layouts, and ramp construction. Right angles weren't just theoretical, they were life-saving. A misaligned temple didn't just anger the gods, it flooded in the rainy season. In this view, the tablet is a practical tool, a cheat sheet, a construction calculator baked into clay. But others have a more ambitious theory. It was a teaching aid, meant to demonstrate number relationships to young scribes in training. Like an ancient workbook, fill in the missing sides exercises. That would make it the oldest known example of structured math education in human history. Still, others argue it was part of a theoretical inquiry, that Babylonian scholars were exploring the properties of numbers for their own sake, developing mathematical principles not out of necessity, but out of curiosity. If true, that means Mesopotamian math was not just practical, but abstract, philosophical, and deeply systematized. But then come the objections. Some critics argue that we're projecting modern concepts onto ancient minds, that Plimpton 322 isn't trigonometry, because the Babylonians didn't conceive of triangles the same way we do. They didn't use angles. They didn't have sine and cosine, so calling it trig is like calling a wedge of cheese a laser pointer. And they're not wrong, but they're also not right, because whatever the intention, the result is astonishing. The relationships encoded on the tablet show a mathematical intuition that doesn't just rely on trial and error. It shows structure, planning, and a kind of numerical elegance. In the end, Plimpton 322 is another Sumerian paradox, a dusty, mundane object that might secretly contain the intellectual DNA of modern science, or just a math teacher's ancient lesson plan. And speaking of encoded mysteries, have you seen those weird stones from the Kassite period? The ones covered in celestial beasts and cryptic symbols? Time to decode the Kuduru stones if we can. The meaning of certain recurring symbols on Kassite Kuduru stones. If there were ever a crossover between real estate law and astral worship, it's the Kassite Kuduru. These oddly shaped boundary stones, some rounded like tombstones, others jagged like cosmic warning signs, were the Kassite dynasty's idea of a land deed, and they weren't subtle about it. You didn't just mark who owned what, you summoned the gods to stand guard over the contract. Inscribed in cuneiform with legal jargon about fields, canals, taxes, and inheritances, the Kuduris were meant to be unambiguous. But around the text, sometimes even on top of it, are bizarre, recurring symbols that flip the whole thing from dull contract into mystical commandment. A spade, a goatfish, a horned dragon, a starburst, a stylized turtle, and a scorpion man might all show up on the same stone. To the modern eye, it's like the world's least helpful constellation map. To the Kassites, these were divine signatures, visual references to the Mesopotamian pantheon, shrunk down and carved into stone, like celestial cosigners. So what do the symbols mean? Each one corresponds to a specific deity. The goatfish is Ea, god of wisdom and fresh water. The eight-pointed star is Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and unfortunate love stories. The crescent moon? That's Sin, god of the moon and indecision. Even the scorpion man is someone's divine avatar, probably guarding gates to somewhere dramatic. They functioned not just as decoration, but as magical enforcement. The gods weren't passively witnessing these deals, they were actively involved. If someone violated the contract, these divine symbols promised more than just a stern talking to. They implied cosmic retaliation, infertility, crop failure, or the dreaded, "Your name shall be erased like an inkless tablet" curse. The repeating motifs weren't arbitrary. They were standardized across Kudurus, repeated with ritual precision. This wasn't creative expression. This was template theology. The same gods, the same warnings, the same cosmic fine print. It was bureaucracy raised to divine threat level. But here's where it gets slippery. Some of the symbols have no clear match, or they're used inconsistently, or they appear in clusters that suggest a coded logic, some hidden hierarchy of symbols that scholars still can't fully untangle. Were these arrangements symbolic rankings? Geographic indicators? Celestial calendars? There's enough ambiguity baked into the stone to make any interpreter second-guess themselves. Complicating matters further, some kudurus seem to be retroactive claims written decades after the supposed event. In those cases, the symbols might not just reinforce divine presence, they might be divine alibis, forged with pantheonic approval to make land grabs look like destiny. So while we know who many of the symbols represent, we're still unclear on how they functioned in terms of ritual logic. Were they merely icons, embedded spells, visual legalese meant to invoke divine consensus? Whatever the case, the kudurus remind us that in Kassite Mesopotamia, the divine was never far from the legal. Your land didn't belong to you. It belonged to the gods, and you were just borrowing it under very strict, very symbolic terms. And speaking of the Kassites, where did they come from, anyway? Because just like the symbols they left behind, their origin remains stubbornly untranslated. The origin and linguistic affiliation of the Kassites. For a people who ruled Babylon for over 400 years, the Kassites remain suspiciously blank, like a dynasty run by ghosts with excellent bureaucratic instincts. They appear in the historical record sometime after the fall of the old Babylonian Empire, quietly taking control around 1595 BCE, or whatever decade your favorite chronology allows. Then they ruled with moderate competence, surprising longevity, and a serious commitment to building temples before fading into historical oblivion. So who were they? Linguistically, we don't know. Culturally, a puzzle. Politically, a slow-burning success story that no one seems to remember. Their language is not Semitic, it's not Sumerian, it's not Indo-European, it's something else. An isolate? Possibly. Or maybe a distant cousin of Hurrian, Elamite, or something even more obscure. What we have are fragments, divine names, administrative terms, the occasional personal name. Not enough for fluency, barely enough for guesswork. They left no known literature in their native language, no epic of the Kassite kings, no myths, no legal codes, no curses written in Kassite. Instead, they ruled using Akkadian, the lingua franca of Mesopotamia. Their scribes were Babylonian, their documents, their inscriptions, even their propaganda, all written in the language of their predecessors. It's as if they arrived with no intention of replacing the culture, just controlling it. They adopted Babylonian religion, rebuilt temples, maintained traditions. Where other conquerors imposed, the Kassites assimilated, embedding themselves like polite invaders who didn't want to move the furniture. But their origin? Still a void. Theories abound. Maybe they came from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Maybe they were a coalition of highland tribes migrating in waves. Their presence in earlier texts is marginal names of mercenaries, horse breeders, and border agitators. By the time they took Babylon, they were already intertwined with the region, possibly through military service, diplomatic marriage, or the quiet process of cultural osmosis that turns outsiders into elites. Some Kassite kings even claimed descent from Babylonian lines, blending myth, invention, and strategic genealogy. Their reigns were marked by stability, temple construction, and, yes, those infamous kudurus. Yet, for all their achievements, the Kassites left behind no legacy of self-promotion, no grand monuments, no declarations of cultural superiority. Just a scattered language, a handful of divine names, and a long list of perfectly competent rulers who never told us who they really were. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe erasing themselves from the spotlight was the plan all along. Or maybe their identity was always blended, never fixed, never pure, always part Babylonian, part mountain, part myth. Either way, their linguistic silence is deafening. And yet, the scripts they adopted cuneiform lasted longer than any dynasty, including theirs. Long after the Kassites were gone, that wedge-shaped writing refused to die. The real question is, why? Why did cuneiform stick around for so long, even when simpler alphabets were banging at the door with promises of easier spelling? Why cuneiform endured long after alphabets, prestige, precision, or priestly control? By the first millennium BCE, alphabets were spreading like wildfire. The Phoenicians had boiled language down to 20-something letters. The Greeks added vowels. The Aramaeans were scribbling fluently across empires. Writing was getting faster, cheaper, easier. It was the Iron Age of information. And yet, cuneiform refused to die. That clunky, wedge-based script requiring styluses, specialized training, and serious wrist strength persisted for centuries, well into the reigns of kings who were surrounded by alphabetic options. Why? It wasn't out of convenience. Cuneiform was the linguistic equivalent of stone carving. It took years to master. It required thousands of signs for different languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian. Each sign had multiple meanings. The grammar was nightmarish. And if you pressed your stylus at the wrong angle, congratulations, you just changed. Victory to cow intestines. And yet it endured, which suggests something deeper than inertia. First, prestige. Cuneiform was the script of empires. It was ancient, sacred, and synonymous with authority. A scribe trained in cuneiform wasn't just literate, he was initiated, a member of a priestly elite. Writing in cuneiform was like quoting Latin in a boardroom, unnecessary, but deeply intimidating. Second, precision. Cuneiform, for all its complexity, was remarkably expressive. It could handle legal nuance, divine poetry, astronomical calculation, grammatical invention. It wasn't flexible, it was exact. Where alphabets simplified, cuneiform specified. It was a tool designed to handle bureaucracy at a cosmic scale. Third, priestly control. Learning cuneiform took years. It wasn't something you picked up from the marketplace. This created a gatekeeping class: scribes, priests, officials who could control access to law, divination, contracts, and literature. Alphabetic systems threatened that monopoly. Too easy. Too common. So even as Aramaic and Phoenician scripts spread, cuneiform held firm, especially in temples, in archives, in rituals that demanded tradition. Eventually, it did fade. Aramaic overtook it. In administration, alphabetic literacy rose. The last known cuneiform tablet was written in the 1st century CE, possibly by a lonely scholar scribbling into silence. But it had a 3,000-year run, from clay tokens to cosmic omens, from Sumerian sheep counts to Assyrian apocalypse prophecies. And in that time, it became more than script, it became memory, an artifact of civilization that refused to be streamlined. The scribes may be gone, but their styluses carved time into clay, and somehow the clay still speaks. The industrial-scale recipe and firing regime, behind Babylon's deep blue glazes. Among the many things Babylon was good at bragging, walls, imperial overreach, one of its most hypnotic legacies is something deceptively delicate. Its deep blue glazes. You've seen them. If not in person, then in museum photos or travel documentaries, narrated by someone whispering reverently over reconstructions of the Ishtar Gate. That almost glowing, lapis-colored surface? Not paint. Glaze. A technological triumph in the guise of divine aesthetics. And here's the weird part. We still don't fully know how they did it. Because unlike crude coatings or slapdash pottery tints, Babylonian blue glazes weren't improvisational. They were engineered. They required exact measurements, specialized materials, and a firing process that bordered on alchemy. And yes, they did it on an industrial scale because when you want to impress gods, ambassadors, and future archaeologists, small batches just don't cut it. Let's talk chemistry. To create that unmistakable rich cobalt blue hue, they needed a silica base from sand or quartz, a flux, probably plant ash or natron, and a colorant, most likely copper compounds. Cobalt wasn't known to them in a refined form, but copper oxides could produce a similar spectrum when fired just right. That alone was tricky. Get the proportions wrong, and instead of sky blue divine brilliance, you end up with brown sludge or green slime. Not exactly Ishtar-worthy. Then came the firing. Unlike pottery, which is typically baked once and called a day, glazes needed precise, staged heating. The furnace had to reach somewhere around 900 degrees Celsius, with stable temperatures maintained for long enough to allow the glaze to melt, bond with the clay, and not bubble like a failed science fair volcano. That would be impressive on a single piece, but the Babylonians scaled it up. We're talking miles of glazed bricks lining gates, walls, and temples. Hundreds of thousands of bricks each painted, glazed, and fired somehow produced with standardized dimensions and matching colors across years of production. How? No kilns have survived with full evidence of this process. We suspect updraft kilns were used, but the exact configuration stacking techniques, airflow regulation, kiln chamber design remains speculative. It's as if someone took the factory blueprints and used them to make more bricks. And this wasn't just aesthetic, it was cosmic. Blue was the color of the divine, evoking lapis lazuli, the sky, and the celestial realm. When you walked through the Ishtar Gate, flanked by lions, bulls, and dragons glazed in radiant blue, you weren't just entering a city. You were being funneled into a sacred landscape where kings communed with gods, and you were very, very small. Still, the knowledge behind this ceramic sorcery vanished. As Babylon declined, so did its recipes. No tablets detail the glaze process, no training manuals, just the bricks, still glowing. So the question lingers, was this knowledge guarded, passed down in secret within a priesthood of keyline masters, or was it common enough that no one thought to write it down until it wasn't? Either way, the legacy glimmers. But Babylon wasn't just coding its present in beauty, it was also building on its past, sometimes literally. Which leads us to the next mystery, where the hell was Agade, Sargon's capital, the lost city that somehow founded an empire and then vanished. The exact site of Agade, Sargon's lost capital. You would think that if a man invented empire, revolutionized warfare, terrified half of Mesopotamia, and claimed to have washed his weapons in the sea, we'd at least be able to point at a map and say, here, this is where he ruled from. Nope. Sargon of Akkad, conqueror of kings, scourge of city-states, builder of the first true multi-city empire in history. Left behind, no capital. Not one brick, not one street, not even a commemorative plaque saying, Sargon slept here. The city of Agade, the administrative brain of the Akkadian Empire, has never been found. This isn't a minor oversight. It's like losing Rome, or forgetting where Washington, D.C. is. And yet Agade, the political and symbolic center of a world-changing state, has disappeared so completely that some scholars whisper about curses and cosmic punishments. We do have textual references, lots, in fact. Agade appears in royal inscriptions, later chronicles, even in the Sumerian lamentations after the empire's fall. It was said to be full of gold, lapis, and divine favor. It had docks. It had ziggurats. It had statues of Sargon's daughter Enheduanna praying so hard her words became poetry. Agade was described as a jewel, a marvel, a city touched by gods until it got arrogant and was smote into the dirt by divine rage. See also every other Mesopotamian city eventually. So, why can't we find it? Some say we've already found it, we just don't know it. Several candidate sites exist. Sippar, Tel Brak, somewhere near Baghdad. Excavations have turned up Akkadian-era buildings, but no definitive welcome to Agade inscriptions, nothing that seals the ID. Others argue that Agade was razed so thoroughly, either by the Gutians, by environmental collapse, or by the Akkadians themselves, in an empire-wide reset that no trace survived. It may have been built in a region prone to flooding, where sediment buried it under layers of silt, or perhaps it was constructed quickly, on a temporary scale, never meant to endure beyond Sargon's heirs. There's also the theory that Agade wasn't a traditional city at all. Maybe it was a floating court, a mobile capital built around military camps and temporary command centers. The empire was constantly expanding. Maybe Agade was less a place and more a system, a network of command nodes anchored by ideology rather than stone. But that feels like a stretch. The texts describe temples, statues, infrastructure. This wasn't a tent city. It was a metaphysical hub where kings communed with the divine and paperwork reached its ultimate form. So we're left with a historical paradox. The more important a city becomes, the more frustrating its absence. Agade shaped Mesopotamia for centuries, and yet its physical form remains an absence. Which raises another question. What if it didn't disappear, but mutated, became something else? Swallowed by rising marshes, or cannibalized by newer cities? Whatever happened, Agade is now a phantom, remembered by everyone, located by no one. But the marshes, yes, the Sealand dynasty, born in those swampy backwaters, didn't just hide, they ruled. Which brings us to a mystery equally dense and soggy. How big was this marsh empire really? The size, reach, and administration of the marsh-based Sealand dynasty. In the shadow of Babylon's grandeur, while northern kings wrote in stone and posed dramatically, the Sealand dynasty quietly built a kingdom in the one place no one else wanted, the marshes. Stretching through the southern alluvium, where the Tigris and Euphrates collapse into 1,000 watery veins, this swampy region was half water, half land, and fully inhospitable, which made it the perfect place to be left alone and the perfect refuge when empires collapsed. So in the aftermath of the old Babylonian period, while cities burned and dynasties died, the Sealand rulers emerged, like alligators in a suit, mud-covered, literate, and surprisingly organized. But here's the mystery. We don't really know how big their kingdom was, or how it worked, or who exactly they were. Most of what we know comes from a handful of tablets, accidentally preserved, found far from where they ruled. The dynasty was probably centered somewhere near Lagash or but we're not sure. Their capital might have been hidden in the wetlands, an ancient Venice, without the singing gondoliers. Some scholars argue they were Amorite holdouts, descendants of the southern elites who resisted northern takeover. Others think they were local marsh people, long marginalized, who used the chaos to seize control. Either way, they managed to run an independent state for nearly 200 years, despite constant pressure from the Kassites, Elamites, and whatever regional nightmare was trending at the time. Their administration? Mysterious, but not primitive. They used cuneiform. They issued contracts, land grants, even correspondence. Some tablets are stamped with seals that reference Sealand kings' names that appear nowhere else, tied to places we haven't found. It's like discovering a government with its own archives, but no postal code. How did they govern a marsh? Possibly by boat. Their entire infrastructure may have been amphibious, floating grain stores, elevated walkways, canals turned into highways. This wasn't a backwards kingdom. It was a fluid one, flexible, elusive, and resistant to siege warfare. Try marching an army through a swamp and see how far you get. They may have taxed trade moving through the Gulf, or controlled access to key river branches, or simply survived by not being worth conquering until they suddenly were. Eventually, the Kassites subsumed them. Whether by conquest or absorption, the Sealand dynasty vanished, but it left behind just enough records to remind us they existed. Enough to make us wonder how much else lies beneath the reeds. So now we ask, did they have their own myths? Their own rites? And did they, like so many other Mesopotamian powers, perform the infamous sacred marriage ritual, that peculiar, uncomfortable collision of gods, kings, and symbolic copulation? The reality of the sacred marriage rite, symbolic pageant, or literal couplings. Ah, the sacred marriage rite, one part divine theater, one part bureaucratic fertility ritual, and at least 2 parts deeply uncomfortable. This mysterious ceremony, central to Mesopotamian religious life, is best known for its dramatic claim that once a year, the king would have sex with a priestess in a temple to reenact the union of a god and goddess, thus securing the fertility of the land. At least, that's what the tablets imply. But like all good Mesopotamian mysteries, the further you read, the less clear it gets. Was it literal, symbolic, spiritual? Drunken performance art with incense and awkward eye contact? Let's back up. In theory, the ritual was a reenactment of the divine marriage between Dumuzi and Inanna, the shepherd god and the goddess of war and love, respectively. In the myth, Dumuzi courts Inanna with a series of innuendos that make modern romantic comedies seem shy by comparison. Their union is what keeps the crops growing, the herds fertile, and society vaguely functional. So naturally, kings decided that if it worked for the gods, it would work for them. Enter the high priestess, often the entu of a major temple, sometimes a royal daughter, always a woman of significant status. The king would symbolically become Dumuzi, the priestess would embody Inanna. Together, they would perform the union of heaven and earth. But here's the catch. We don't know if they actually had sex. Some scholars argue yes, citing hymns that are extremely descriptive. There are entire stanzas devoted to the goddess inviting her lover to plow her holy vulva. Yes, really. The poetry was not subtle. In this reading, the rite was literal, performed behind veils, surrounded by incense, with ritual scripts guiding every gesture. Others argue no, that the sex was metaphorical, and the real act was a series of ritual meals, libations, and recitations. The coupling happened in verse, not flesh. The physical act was too sacred, or too politically fraught, or maybe just too logistically complex in front of a live audience. Still others split the difference. Maybe there was a private consummation behind closed curtains, followed by a public celebration, a kind of ceremonial after-party with music, dancers, and actors reenacting the myth in ways that were dramatic, suggestive, and very much not PG. What's certain is that the rite was highly political. It elevated the king as the earthly stand-in for a god. It reaffirmed his divine mandate to rule. And by linking royal authority with agricultural fertility, it cleverly made a king's legitimacy dependent on the harvest. Crops fail? Must be a bad king. Better bring in someone with better ritual technique. And, of course, it was all staged within temples, those hybrid institutions that mixed religion, economics, politics, and performance into a single mud brick megachurch. So, whether the sacred marriage was carnal or chaste, literal or liturgical, it functioned as state-sponsored myth-making. It turned governance into drama, desire into diplomacy, reproduction into policy. But that kind of coordination takes more than poetry. It takes planning, labor, infrastructure. Which leads us to an even murkier question. Who ran the irrigation systems, the literal lifeblood of Mesopotamian survival? Temples? Kings? Or the ancient equivalent of water rights committees? How irrigation regimes were organized, temple command, private enterprise, or hybrid? If cuneiform was the brain of Mesopotamian civilization, irrigation was its circulatory system. Water didn't just make life possible, it made cities possible. Without canals, there was no wheat, no barley, no bricks, just dust and regrets. But who actually controlled the water? That's where things get murky fittingly, since irrigation meant dealing with mud, leaks, and occasional divine flooding. The historical record gives us fragments, contracts, field measurements, legal disputes over water access. What it doesn't give us is a clear diagram of who was in charge. In the earliest periods, think Uruk and early dynastic Sumer, most scholars believe irrigation was temple managed. Temples weren't just places to pray and leave goat meat for the gods. They were economic hubs, complete with land holdings, labor rosters, and canal building teams. Priests oversaw canal dredging, gate maintenance, and seasonal flood management. When your god is literally responsible for rivers, his house better control the plumbing. But over time, as city-states expanded and royal power centralized, kings got involved. Big time. Inscriptions from later periods show rulers bragging about digging the canal of life, restoring the ancient waterway, or making the desert bloom, often with the help of a suspiciously unnamed workforce. So now we have a dual power structure: temples managing religious agrarian projects, kings commissioning grand public works, and both taking credit. But it wasn't just top-down. Evidence suggests there were also local water cooperatives, small landowners banding together to build, maintain, and schedule water access. They had to coordinate planting times, irrigation rotations, and drainage strategies, or risk flooding their own fields, or worse, their neighbors' dispersant. Cue the legal tablets. Year of the lawsuit between Farmer X and Farmer Y over stolen irrigation water. This implies a hybrid system, part state-run, part temple-controlled, part communal, kind of like a spiritual HOA with royal supervision and ancient Karens complaining about canal weeds. And of course, irrigation wasn't just technical, it was ritualized. Festivals marked the opening of canals. Priests read omens to predict flood timing. The rivers themselves were deified. Tigris and Euphrates weren't just waterways, they were divine agents who gave and took, sometimes generously, sometimes with wrath. But irrigation brought risk, too. If the canals clogged, fields failed. If floods came early, crops drowned. If salinization took hold, and it did, it turned fertile land into sterile crust. Managing water was a high-stakes game, and failing at it could collapse entire economies. So irrigation wasn't just infrastructure. It was power ritual, political, and hydraulic. And if the water went bad, everything else followed. Which brings us to a crisis so slow and subtle that it almost escaped the historical radar: salinization. A creeping salt plague that ruined fields, distorted cities, and may have helped break the spine of Mesopotamian agriculture. The timing and impact of soil salinization on crops and demography. In Mesopotamia, water giveth, and water taketh away. At first, irrigation transformed barren floodplains into a cereal paradise: endless barley, teeming dates, and empires rising on rivers like bread in a hot oven. But after centuries of diverting the Tigris and Euphrates into the fields, something sinister began to build up just below the surface. Salt. Not the good kind you sprinkle on lentils, the bad kind, the kind that kills. It crept in silently. Every time water was pulled from the rivers, it carried tiny amounts of mineral salts, which then settled into the soil. Without proper drainage, and in Mesopotamia, drainage was a dream, those salts built up, slowly, year by year, until the fields that once fed armies could barely sustain weeds. This wasn't just bad for farmers, it was civilizational rot. Barley, the staple crop, is relatively salt-tolerant, but even barley has limits. Yields dropped, diets shrank, people moved, cities contracted. Land that once supported 1,000 scribes now fed 10 goats and a bitter ex-priest. But when did this start? Some estimates push it back as far as the Ur-3 period, around 2100 BCE, when land records show declining productivity in formerly prime regions. Others argue it became catastrophic during the Old Babylonian period, when royal edicts start granting new, uncultivated land, a possible sign that old fields had died. What we know is this: by the first millennium BCE, large portions of southern Mesopotamia had permanently lost their fertility. The Sumerian heartland, Lagash, was fading. The soil had been worked to death. Ironically, the same irrigation systems that made civilization possible were also salting its grave. There were attempts to fix it: crop rotations, alternate fields, even temporary abandonment. But the salt always came back, and with it came economic strain, political collapse, and migration. The slow death of the soil wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with battles or burning walls. It came with quiet desperation: lower yields, higher taxes, more debt, less faith. Which raises a painful question: did the people know what was happening? Did they see the salt building up and realize the empire was crumbling under its own ingenuity? Maybe not. Maybe they thought the gods were angry, the stars misaligned, the priests ineffective. Or maybe they knew and simply had no way out. Because the one thing harder than building a civilization is knowing when to stop irrigating it to death. How city calendars, intercalations, were coordinated, or not, across rival polities. Imagine you're a merchant in ancient Mesopotamia. You're traveling from Lagash to Kish with a wagon full of barley, 3 tired donkeys, and a contract promising delivery by the 15th of Adaru. You arrive only to be told that in Kish, it's still the 10th of Ululu. Congratulations, you're either 5 days early or 7 months late. Welcome to the calendar chaos of ancient Mesopotamia. If there's one thing city-states in ancient Sumer loved more than building ziggurats and suing their neighbors over irrigation canals, it was using different calendars. Sure, they shared the same basic model, a lunar calendar with 12 months of 29 or 30 days each, but beyond that, it was a free-for-all. Each city had its own month names, own start date, and own rules for when to throw in an extra intercalary month to stop the seasons from drifting into absurdity. There was no centralized system, no UN of no calendar czar. If one city decided to add a 13th month to align with the harvest, that was great for them. Their neighbor might still be stuck in midwinter, ritually weeping over a dying god while their rival was already planting spring barley. It's the kind of chaos that only a civilization of expert bureaucrats could fully appreciate. And boy, did they lean into it. The problem of intercalation, inserting an extra month roughly every 3 years to keep lunar calendars aligned with solar reality, was well known. The challenge was that there was no fixed algorithm. Decisions were made ad hoc, usually by priests, astronomers, or whoever had the most clout in the temple that week. The goal was to keep seasonal festivals tied to their correct agricultural context. You can't very well celebrate the sacred marriage if the fields are frozen and the sheep are still molting. But since each city-state handled its own intercalation, the region ended up with dozens of overlapping, inconsistent calendars. 1 month's festival of the first fruits in Nippur might fall weeks apart from the same festival in Ur. And if you're thinking, well, surely trade and diplomacy required coordination, you're absolutely right. And absolutely mistaken. Some cities attempted to align their calendars with political centers during times of empire. Babylon, for instance, tried to impose its month names and cycle during its height. But this standardization rarely lasted. The moment central authority weakened, cities would revert to local control, as if rebelling through timekeeping. This fragmentation wasn't just administrative, it was ideological. Each city believed its temple rituals aligned with cosmic order. Changing the calendar wasn't just an inconvenience, it was theological treason. The gods expected festivals on precise days, move them and risk divine indifference, or worse, divine attention. Still, we find evidence that scribes working in multilingual, multi-city contexts tried to reconcile these differences. Some tablets list dual dates or glosses comparing month names. It's as if some weary administrator finally said, "Fine, let's just write both and let the gods sort it out." So did Mesopotamians ever agree on a calendar? Briefly, when they had to, and even then, grudgingly. But this lack of synchronization didn't just confuse merchants and priests. It also left astronomers with a bigger question. In a world of time drift and heavenly omens, did they ever notice that the stars themselves were shifting over time? That leads us to the next silent enigma. Did Mesopotamian astronomers detect any hint of precession? Whether Mesopotamian astronomers perceived any element of precession, the stars, unlike most gods, are reliably punctual. They rise, they set, they sparkle with ominous meaning. And, in ancient Mesopotamia, they weren't just decoration, they were data. Scribes recorded celestial movements obsessively. The position of Venus, the color of the moon, the sudden arrival of a new star, each was logged, cross-referenced, and turned into a divination forecast more rigorous than your average astrology column. But there's one slow-moving phenomenon that has haunted modern scholars looking back: precession. That is, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which causes the background stars to shift over millennia about 1 degree every 72 years. Over centuries, this drift becomes noticeable. So the question is, did Babylonian astronomers, with their meticulous sky records, ever realize that the stars were moving? At first glance, it seems they should have. The Mul, Apim tablets, dating to the 1st millennium BCE, detail star risings and settings, heliacal phenomena, and celestial zones with remarkable accuracy. The Venus tablets, the Enuma, Anu, Enlil omens, these aren't vague sky poetry. They're quantified, recorded, compared across generations. But here's the problem. There's no explicit mention of precession. Despite centuries of watching the stars, scribes didn't leave us a clear, "Hey, wait a second, Aldebaran's off by 5 degrees" moment. Their star catalogs reflect consistency within a few centuries, but not over the kind of timescale needed to notice axial wobble. That doesn't mean they were blind to it. It's possible they noticed anomalies, slight shifts in stellar risings, irregularities in the calendar, but attributed them to divine will, not astronomical mechanics. After all, Mesopotamian astronomy was primarily omen-based, not explanatory. It wasn't about building heliocentric models. It was about interpreting signs from the gods. That said, some scholars have pointed to subtle clues. The organization of star lists into 3 stars each, a system aligning stars with the gods Anu, Enlil, and Ea, may reflect attempts to track long-term changes in celestial behavior. And variations in recorded star positions across centuries could be indirect evidence of observational awareness. But did they identify the phenomenon of precession itself? Almost certainly not. Unlike the Greeks, who eventually gave us Hipparchus and a formal recognition of precession, the Mesopotamians didn't leave theoretical treatises. Their genius lay in recording patterns, not explaining them. They didn't ask why the sky shifted. They asked what it meant when it did. And honestly, that's more terrifying. Because imagine watching the stars drift over generations, tiny creeping betrayals of divine order, and not knowing why, just feeling that something sacred is off, that the heavens are tilting, that the gods are turning their backs ever so slightly. In that silence, in that absence of explanation, lies one of the most human mysteries of all. And it's not just the stars that stared back with unblinking eyes. Inside temples, across the plains of Eshnunna, rows of alabaster statues stared back too wide-eyed, eerily alert, and wholly unreadable. What were the Tel Asmar statues actually doing in those sanctuaries? And who were they watching, exactly? what the wide-eyed Tel Asmar statues did ritually inside sanctuaries. They stand frozen in time, a congregation of small, wide-eyed figures, hands clasped, beards chiseled, pupils enormous. Found buried beneath a temple floor in Tel Asmar, these statues look less like devout worshippers and more like people who've just seen something they shouldn't have and are too polite to say so. But make no mistake, these weren't toys, portraits, or decorative clutter. They were ritual stand-ins, eternal witnesses, possibly even proxies for prayer. The Tel Asmar hoard, also known as the Eshnuna votive statues, dates to around 2900 and 2600 BCE and was discovered in a temple dedicated to the god Abu, a local deity of vegetation, healing, or possibly just vague benevolence. The statues vary in size, detail, and material, some alabaster, some gypsum, but they share key features: stylized beards or braids, clasped hands, inscribed names, and most disturbingly, those giant staring eyes. So what were they for? The prevailing theory is that they were votive offerings left in the temple by worshippers to represent themselves in perpetual prayer. Because if you couldn't be in the temple 24 per s, even and who can, really, you left a little version of yourself to do the spiritual heavy lifting. These statues didn't just sit, they prayed. Forever. The wide eyes, symbolic of eternal vigilance or spiritual attentiveness. Always watching, always waiting, always reminding the god, hey, I'm still faithful, don't forget my barley field. But here's the twist. They weren't all personalized. Some are generic, mass-produced even. A kind of spiritual stock model, perhaps rented out by less wealthy believers or left as general offerings on behalf of the community. And they were buried intentionally. The statues found under the floor weren't discarded. They were ritually retired. Like broken idols, they couldn't be simply thrown out. Once imbued with sacred presence, they required careful burial, lest their now silent eyes cause divine offense. Still, the mystery lingers. Were they truly stand-ins? Or something more? Could they have been considered inhabited by spirit or divinity? A kind of ancient Sumerian homunculus theory? Or were they simply offerings beautiful, strange, and unnerving? Their arrangement suggests intentionality. They faced inward, toward a central altar, like a frozen congregation, and yet none of them show the god Abu himself. No icon, no statue, just the worshippers, staring forever into the absence. Which makes one wonder, was the point of the ritual not the god, but the witnessing? Because if no one is watching, does piety matter? The Tel Asmar statues were watching, and their silence might be the loudest prayer of all. But not all statues in Mesopotamia were stand-ins for the faithful. Some were art, others propaganda, and some were masks. Literal masks like the Mask of Warka, whose identity is still hauntingly unknown, whom the Mask of Warka represents goddess, queen, or an idealized mortal. She has no name, no eyes, no crown, just a face carved from alabaster, impossibly smooth, lips parted slightly, hair once inlaid with precious metals or painted, now long gone. Known only as the Mask of Warka, she's been staring at us quietly and without explanation since around 3100 BCE. And yet, after more than 5,000 years of scrutiny, we still don't know who she is. Found in the ruins of ancient Uruk, buried within the debris of the Iana temple complex, this mask, arguably the oldest naturalistic depiction of a human face in the world, is about the size of a human head. But it wasn't designed to be freestanding. It's just the face, hollow at the back, meant to be mounted onto a body, probably made of wood, possibly dressed in robes, crowned, adorned with jewelry, and made dazzling with inlays. What survives is the ghost, a blank, stylized face where identity should be. So, who is she? One popular theory is that she represents Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and, let's face it, general chaos. That would make sense, given that she was the patron deity of Uruk, and the mask was found in a temple dedicated to her. In this reading, the mask was not just a statue, it was the goddess herself, or at least her earthly vessel. Worshippers may have entered the temple and gazed upon this face, believing they were in the presence of divine beauty and celestial judgment. Heavy stuff for a chunk of alabaster. But not everyone agrees. Others suggest it could be a queen, or a priestess, perhaps even Enheduanna, the first known named author in history, but there's no inscription, no context, no stylistic markers that shout royalty. Just the quiet, unnerving perfection of a woman's face rendered in a style that's simultaneously idealized and eerily lifelike. Then there's the third option. She's not anyone in particular. She's not a goddess, or a queen, or a specific person. She's an archetype, an artistic abstraction of femininity or divinity, a visual placeholder for power. In that case, the identity is deliberately missing, the same way modern corporations put a face on their brand but never tell you who the person is. What adds another layer of spookiness to the mask is how she's survived. She's been through it. Looted during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, lost for weeks in the chaos, found hidden in a farmer's field wrapped in rags, stashed in a backyard, ancient, sacred, almost kidnapped by history itself. And yet, she endures. But endure into what? A goddess without a name? A face with no body? A sculpture that was meant to be whole but now lives forever as a fragment? Her gaze seems eternal, yet she has no pupils. Her mouth seems to speak, yet she has no voice. Her silence demands interpretation, and that's the trap. Every explanation says more about us than her. And if you think the ambiguity stops there, just wait. Because while the Mask of Warka might be a still frame of beauty, the uruk vase is a full-blown ritual sequence, and no one can quite agree what the hell is happening on that thing either. What, exactly? The uruk vase ritual sequence depicts, and its calendrical timing. Carved in alabaster with unnervingly precise scenes and found in the same temple complex as the Mask of Warka, the uruk vase is essentially Mesopotamia's first cinematic experience. 3 stacked registers spiral up its tall body, forming a narrative that looks like it might explain everything if only we could agree on what it means. The top tier shows a goddess, probably Inanna, standing in front of a temple, flanked by a priest or king who offers her a gift, possibly crops, possibly livestock, possibly a metaphor for existential submission. Below them, naked male figures march in procession, carrying baskets, jars, and offerings. Still lower, rows of plants and animals, barley, rams, dates parading like a Mesopotamian Noah's Ark audition. So, what's going on here? One theory is that it's a depiction of the New Year's festival, known as the Akitu, a major calendar event marking the rebirth of order from chaos. In this interpretation, the vase captures a sequence of ritual acts, the offering of first fruits, the reenactment of divine submission, and the renewal of fertility across the land. Others say it's about sacred marriage. Again, yes, that ritual just keeps turning up, where the king presents himself to Inanna as Dumuzi, offering symbols of prosperity in exchange for divine favor and cosmic legitimacy. In this version, the vase is a wedding invitation, carved in stone and forever replaying the divine consummation. Then there are those who say it's none of those things, that the vase is a political allegory. The naked men represent submission subjects bringing tribute to the central authority, voluntarily or otherwise. It's not a religious rite, it's a display of centralized power, where offerings are the price of peace and Inanna is the ultimate tax collector. The problem is, the vase doesn't label anything. No inscriptions, no captions, no helpful, "this is barley" arrows. Just images. which means modern scholars are trapped in a visual escape room with no key, trying to decode 5,000-year-old pageantry without subtitles. And then there's the matter of timing. If this was a New Year's rite, what calendar was it following? What month? Was it lunar aligned, solar-based, or scheduled according to omens, flood levels, and how irritable the gods seemed that season? We'll probably never know. But maybe that's the point. The vase isn't a diagram, it's a ritualized abstraction, a visual incantation. It wasn't meant to be understood in the modern sense. It was meant to work to summon divine attention, to reenact a story that made the crops grow, the rivers flow, and the king matter. And in that way, it's less about clarity and more about rhythm, which is ironic because the next mystery concerns a king who broke rhythm entirely. He didn't just offer himself to the gods, he became one. Enter Naram-sin, the first Mesopotamian king to claim divine kingship, and the question of why he did it remains as unsettling as his horned crown. Why Naram-sin adopted divine kingship policy, piety, or propaganda? One day you're king, the next you're a god. For Naram-sin of Akkad, grandson of the famous Sargon, this wasn't a gradual PR campaign. It was a cosmic mic drop. He looked at the long-standing Mesopotamian tradition of mortal kings prostrating before the gods and said, "Yeah, no thanks. I'll take the horns." Literal horns. His most iconic stela, carved in triumphant relief, shows him wearing the horned crown normally reserved for deities. Not kneeling, not serving, ascending. A king climbing a mountain of crushed enemies, trampling the defeated, receiving divine rays of approval. Subtle? Not remotely. Effective? Absolutely. But why would a ruler take such a dangerous theological step? First theory: policy. Naram-sin was trying to stabilize an increasingly stretched and fracturing empire. Divine kingship allowed him to override city-level priesthoods, cut through bureaucratic noise, and assert direct authority over a territory that extended from the Zagros to the Mediterranean. No more middlemen. The gods didn't need to relay messages to their people through priests. Naram-sin would deliver those edicts personally. Second theory: piety. According to inscriptions, it wasn't Naram-sin's idea, it was the gods. Or rather, the assembled citizens and priests decided, through divinely inspired consensus, that he should be deified. It wasn't me, the texts basically say. It was the people. Which sounds remarkably like a clever workaround for imposing rule through spiritual blackmail. It's like being crowned prom king and then telling everyone, "I didn't ask for this power. I was chosen." Third theory: propaganda, pure and cynical. By elevating himself to divine status, Naram-sin transcended local gods. Why argue with competing temples and regional deities when you can just say, "I'm the god now"? If your face is carved into monuments in the same pose as deities, and your titles include King of the Four Quarters and God of Akkad, you're not just claiming power, you're claiming cosmic inevitability. Of course, the backlash came. Later traditions painted Naram-sin as arrogant, cursed, and doomed his hubris, blamed for the fall of Akkad and the Gutian invasion. The gods, according to these narratives, were offended by his self-promotion. Divine wrath followed: famine, chaos, collapse. But even that backlash serves a political purpose. By painting Naram-sin as the cautionary tale, future kings could say, "See, this is why you don't overstep." It's a divine power grab wrapped in an after-school special. The truth is probably all three: policy, piety, and propaganda, braided into a single horned crown. And the fact that the stela was defaced in antiquity, eyes gouged out, inscriptions chiseled away, tells us exactly how controversial it was. Later, regimes tried to erase his claim, but they couldn't erase the legacy. Naram-sin broke the system. He stopped being chosen by the gods and became the god who chose. And that brings us to the mythic fallout. Because when a city forgets its place in the divine pecking order, the gods don't just get angry, they write poetry about it. Enter the curse of Agade, an apocalyptic tale wrapped in vengeance and possibly history. The historical core behind the curse of Agade, and who actually sacked the city. The curse of Agade is not your typical post-apocalyptic lament. It doesn't start with nuclear fallout or alien invaders. It begins with Naram-sin doing something he probably should have thought twice about, sacking the temple of Enlil at Nippur. Bad move. According to this literary time bomb, Enlil, the storm god, master of divine order, and Mesopotamia's eternal HR manager, wasn't pleased. He withdrew his favor. The gods abandoned the city. Chaos ensued. Agade fell. And who were the instruments of divine justice? The Gutians, wild highland invaders described with the kind of poetic contempt usually reserved for tax collectors and cannibals. But here's where things unravel faster than a reed basket in a flood. Was any of this true? Let's start with the basics. Agade did fall. There was a collapse, a disruption, a shift in power. The city, once the shining jewel of the Akkadian Empire, vanished so thoroughly we can't even locate it today. Something bad happened. But the curse is not a report. It's literary vengeance. Written centuries after the events it describes, it's part propaganda, part cautionary tale, part religious theater. Its message is clear. Defy the gods, and they'll turn your empire into rubble. So who actually sacked Agade? Possibility 1. The Gutians, as tradition says. They're often described as uncivilized, non-literate, chaos incarnate. But that may be propaganda by later Sumerian scribes who didn't like outsiders muddying up the alluvium. The Gutians may have just been opportunists, mountain tribes taking advantage of Akkadian weakness after environmental collapse or internal strife. Possibility 2. Economic and ecological collapse. Climate shifts, droughts, salinization, and overextension may have caused the empire to buckle from within. Agade didn't fall in a blaze of enemy swords. It shrugged itself apart from the inside. Possibility 3. A combination of both. The internal systems failed, and the Gutians or other rival groups moved in to deliver the final blow, like jackals to a dying lion. But the curse of Agade isn't interested in material explanations. It's a moral universe. In this story, Naram-sin overreached. He tore down a temple. He declared himself divine. And for that, the gods responded with supernatural devastation. Darkness at noon, silence in the shrines, swarms of invaders, the whole divine punishment buffet. The story is less about history and more about warning. It's a theological audit, a dramatic way of telling future kings, don't get cute with the gods. They're still watching. And yet, there's something powerful about the fact that this tale survived at all. It was copied, recopied, performed. The fall of Agade became a mythic template used to explain collapse for centuries. Even when the empire is gone, the story remains. And just when you think Mesopotamia is done with dramatic exits, another king makes a wild decision: build an entire capital city from scratch, only to abandon it almost immediately. Welcome to Dur-sharrukin, the city of Sargon II, and a real estate disaster on a god-sized scale. Why Sargon II's brand new Dur-sharrukin was abruptly abandoned for Nineveh. You're a powerful Neo-Assyrian king. You've got wealth, armies, and a divine mandate. So you build the ultimate flex, a brand new capital. Not just any capital, a fortress, palace, temple complex carved from ambition and carved into history. You name it, Dur-sharrukin, fortress of Sargon, because modesty is for the weak. You commission massive walls, sculpt colossal guardian lamassu, decorate halls with war scenes and tribute lists, and make sure every inch of the city screams, I am inevitable. And then, before the paint dries, you die in battle. and the city is abandoned. What happened? First, the background. Sargon II ruled from 722 to 705 BCE and was, by most accounts, a competent, energetic ruler with a serious branding problem. He wasn't a direct descendant of Tiglath-Pileser III, and he needed to prove his legitimacy. So he built a new capital from scratch, north of Nineveh, near modern Khorsabad. This wasn't just a vanity project, it was political theater, architectural theology, and a bureaucratic reboot. And it worked, for a while. Dur-sharrukin became the center of state. Construction accelerated. The walls rose. The palace took form. Texts were dated year X of the founding of Dur-sharrukin. It was a city birthed in full divine alignment, or so the records claim. Then came Sargon's death, killed in battle in Tabal, far from his sacred city. And here's the thing, his body was never recovered. That's a spiritual catastrophe in the ancient Near East. No burial meant no proper afterlife, no protection from restless spirits. It was bad PR and worse theology. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, took the throne, and within a year, he moved the capital to Nineveh, abandoning Dur-sharrukin entirely. All that labor, all that gold, all those inscriptions left behind like an unread resume. Why? Part of it may have been political. Sennacherib needed to distance himself from his father's bad luck. Dur-sharrukin was tainted and unlucky city. It had failed to protect its founder. Starting over in Nineveh offered a fresh divine narrative, but it might also have been practical. Dur-sharrukin was new, but Nineveh had history. It had temples, infrastructure, symbolic weight. It was the safe bet. And so, Dur-sharrukin, the dream city, became a ghost town almost overnight. Its legacy? Giant statues buried in dust, unfinished rooms, and a very expensive lesson in the limits of kingly confidence. Even gods, it seems, don't appreciate architectural ego trips. But within the ruins of Sargon's ambitions lay another kind of treasure, the libraries of Assyria packed with knowledge. Which raises the final question, what didn't survive? What works? What ideas? What science was lost when Ashurbanipal's library fell silent forever? What genres? Works were lost from Ashurbanipal's library, and how much science vanished. Ashurbanipal, king, conqueror, enthusiast of long titles, was also, weirdly, the ancient world's biggest book hoarder. While most kings collected land, heads, or wives, Ashurbanipal collected clay tablets, tens of thousands of them. Cuneiform stacked floor to ceiling, in multiple languages, sorted by subject, tucked into rooms in his palace at Nineveh. His library wasn't a curiosity, it was an imperial data center. And then it was destroyed. In the mid-7th century BCE, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed in a stunning display of karma and coalition warfare, Nineveh was sacked. Fires swept the palace, roofs collapsed. The library so carefully curated was baked and buried. Ironically, the destruction helped preserve many tablets, but not all. Because here's the real mystery. What didn't survive? We know what was there, thanks to catalogs, references, and a tantalizing number of surviving fragments. There were omen texts, medical manuals, rituals, hymns, dictionaries, astronomical tables, and royal correspondence. Ashurbanipal had copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, treaties from rivals, and possibly the ancient equivalent of curse removal FAQs. But there were also gaps, entire shelves we can only guess at, works referenced in other tablets that are now just gone. For example, Mesopotamian medicine. We have recipes involving crushed turtle shell, fish bile, and incantations against demons. But many diseases are described without context, and the diagnostic manuals which must have existed are incomplete. The ancient doctors knew things we don't time, things their tablets never had the chance to whisper, Then there's mathematics. Babylonian math was astonishing. Base 60 systems, square roots, early trigonometry. Some surviving tablets suggest they understood relationships between triangles that wouldn't be rediscovered until Greek and Islamic scholars centuries later. And yet, we only have fragments. There could have been entire theoretical treatises, the calculus of cuneiform now reduced to ash and shards. And astronomy? Even worse. The Enuma Anu Enlil and Mul Apin series show systematic skywatching, star catalogs, eclipse predictions, planetary risings. But we lack the full structure. The models behind their predictions are hinted at, never revealed. Somewhere in the library, there may have been a master tablet, the blueprint for their cosmic framework, lost. But it's not just science. There's likely poetry that vanished, drama, philosophy, legal thought, even myths we never got to misinterpret. The Mesopotamians had thousands of years to write, copy, and organize. Ashurbanipal wanted it all. He ordered scribes to copy texts from every city. He even sent troops to borrow tablets permanently from rival temples. He imagined himself as the steward of all knowledge. And then gone. When Nineveh fell, the scribes died. The script changed, the knowledge broke. Cuneiform faded into silence, and the ideas trapped inside clay stayed unread for millennia. How much was lost? Enough to keep scholars up at night. Enough to imagine that somewhere in that buried ruin, beneath collapsed corridors and scorched archives, lie the missing pages of human thought, things we've reinvented poorly or forgotten entirely. But even as we mourn the missing, we must ask, who were the last to read them? Who were the final cuneiform scribes? The ones who kept the flame burning long after the temples fell silent? Which leads to the final curtain of Mesopotamian literacy. When, where, and why did cuneiform finally go dark? When, where, and why cuneiform finally went dark, the last schools and last readers. Writing began in Mesopotamia with lists of sheep. It ended with lists of kings and prayers no one understood anymore. Cuneiform, the world's first and longest-running script, didn't die with a bang. It faded, like a chant whispered by fewer and fewer voices until the last voice forgot the words. But pinpointing exactly when and where this happened is like trying to hear the last note of a disappearing song. By the time of the 1st century CE, the script had all but vanished. Greek and Aramaic ruled the region. Clay had given way to parchment and paper. Empires changed hands. Cities collapsed and rebuilt. But for a few final centuries, there were still scribal holdouts, the islands of continuity, clinging to a drowned world. The last known datable cuneiform tablet is from 75 CE, from Babylon. It's a mundane text, perhaps an astronomical record. No final flourish, no farewell. Just another day in the life of a fading tradition, but the writing is already fossilized, imitative, formulaic, preserved like a prayer repeated by someone who's forgotten the meaning. So why did it disappear? One reason is painfully obvious. No one used it anymore. Cuneiform was complex, hundreds of signs, multiple languages, layers of scribal tradition. It took years of training to master. And who wants to spend a decade learning dead scripts when you can pick up Aramaic in half the time and actually send a letter? Another factor: loss of institutional support. The temples that once funded scribes, stored archives, and maintained scribal schools were increasingly obsolete. As religious authority shifted and empires changed, Achaemenids, Seleucids, Parthians, the cuneiform tradition lost its sponsors. The libraries weren't burned, they were ignored. Also, no one remembered how to teach it. You can't pass on a system if you don't understand it. Later scribes could still copy forms, but comprehension eroded. Think of a modern reader trying to reproduce a medieval illuminated manuscript, pretty but hollow. By the end, it was ritual without meaning. And finally, deliberate abandonment. New rulers wanted streamlined administration. Aramaic alphabets were faster. Greek was trendier. Bureaucracies modernized. Traditions fell out of favor. Cuneiform didn't just die, it was let go. The last scribes must have known. They must have sensed the silence closing in. Perhaps they continued writing out of habit, out of pride, out of belief. Or maybe they saw themselves as the final witnesses recording the last flickers of a script that once defined civilization. And then, nothing. For nearly 2,000 years, no one could read cuneiform. The tablets sat in ruins, in museums, on shelves, silent. Until the 19th century, when scholars cracked the code, and the words of ancient scribes began to breathe again. But there's something haunting about that long silence, about how knowledge can vanish so completely, about how the greatest civilization of its age could leave behind libraries, epics, rituals, and bricks, and still become a mystery. A mystery we're still deciphering. Because in the end, Mesopotamia doesn't just challenge our knowledge, it dares us to remember.